Hello and welcome. Tonight our journey takes us to a world of endless grass, ruled by a boundless sky. It is a world without walls, without cities, and seemingly without a centre. From this vast emptiness, a power would arise that would, for a brief, astonishing moment, hold nearly the entire known world in its grasp. It was an empire forged not from stone and mortar, but from horses, arrows, and the sheer indomitable will of a single man. This is the story of the Mongol Empire. It is a profound paradox, a civilization born from the saddle that created an era of unprecedented global connection. A people who revered the open steppe, yet came to rule over the most magnificent and ancient cities on earth. They were destroyers of worlds, and yet they were also the architects of a new one, creating the largest contiguous land empire in the history of humanity. Tonight, we will ride across the wind-swept plains of Central Asia to witness the birth of a nation. We will follow a boy, outcast and abandoned, on his path to becoming Genghis Khan, the ruler of all men, and we will watch as the storm he unleashes reshapes the very map of the world. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, subscribing to the channel is a simple and wonderful way to offer your support. It means a great deal to me, and it ensures you won't miss our future explorations. I am also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you are joining me tonight. Let me know in the comments below. And now, settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us travel back to a time of felt tents and smoky fires, to the sound of a million hooves thundering across the earth, and to the story of the world forged by the people of the eternal blue sky. Our story does not begin in a palace or a great city. It begins on a vast, unforgiving stage of green and gold, the Eurasian steppe. Imagine a sea of grass stretching from the forests of Siberia to the deserts of the south, an immense open land mass that for centuries was a world unto itself. This was a land of brutal extremes, of scorching summers and winters so cold they could freeze the marrow in your bones. There were no natural barriers here, no mountain ranges to hide behind, no coastlines to define a kingdom. There was only the earth below and the sky above. This environment was a crucible, and it forged a unique kind of people. The peoples of the steppe were nomads, pastoralists whose lives were in constant motion, following their herds of horses, sheep and goats in an endless cycle of seasonal migration. Their homes were not houses but jurs, round, felt tents that could be disassembled and packed onto a cart in under an hour. Their wealth was not in land, which belonged to no one and everyone but in their animals. Their roads were the invisible tracks of tradition, and their fortress was the horizon itself. In the 12th century, this world was a fractured mosaic of rival tribes and clans. The Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, the Karaits, and the Mongols themselves, who were at this time just one minor tribe among many. They were locked in a cycle of endemic warfare, a brutal rhythm of raids and counter-raids, of shifting alliances and bitter blood feuds. It was a world where loyalty was a precious and fragile commodity, often extending no further than one's immediate family. Power was personal, charismatic, and as fleeting as a summer storm. There was no sense of a shared identity, no concept of a nation. These tribes were like scattered droplets of mercury on a shifting plate, constantly breaking apart and reforming, unable to coalesce. To an observer from the great sedentary civilizations that bordered the steppe, the Jin dynasty in China, the sophisticated Khwarezmian Empire in Persia, these nomads were little more than barbarians. They were a nuisance, a threat to be managed with tribute or border forts. But they were not a world historical force. By all logic, they should have remained a footnote, a people forever on the periphery of history. But into this world, around the year 1162, a child was born. He was named Temujin. Legend says he came into the world clutching a clot of blood in his right fist, a dark omen, or perhaps a promise, of the future that awaited him. He was the son of Yesugei, a minor chieftain of the Mongol Borjigin clan, a man of some influence but by no means a great power. Temujin's childhood was to be a masterclass in the cruelty and precarity of steppe life. When he was just 9 years old, His father, Yasuge, was poisoned by their rivals, the Tatars, while sharing a meal under a flag of truce. This single act shattered Temujin's world. According to the harsh laws of steppe politics, the followers of a dead chief owed nothing to his children. Overnight, Temujin, his mother Hoelun, and his siblings were abandoned by their clan. They were cast out, left to fend for themselves in the wilderness, an act that was little more than a death sentence. The years that followed were a desperate struggle for survival. They ate roots, rodents, and whatever fish they could catch. They were hunted by their rivals, who saw the son of Yasuge as a future threat to be eliminated. The young Temujin was captured and forced to wear a wooden collar, a mark of utter humiliation for a steppe warrior. Yet, this crucible of suffering did not break him. Instead, it forged him. It burned away every ounce of youthful innocence and replaced it with a core of tempered steel. He learned that in his world, trust was a weapon, alliances were temporary, and survival depended on a ruthless and unerring understanding of human nature. It was during this period of exile that Temujin began to form the bonds that would become the foundation of his future empire. He swore an oath of blood brotherhood with another young aristocrat named Jamuka, a bond that would one day curdle into a legendary and tragic rivalry. More importantly, he reconnected with Togrul, the Khan of the powerful Kharit tribe and a former ally of his father. Pledging his loyalty to Togrul, Temujin slowly, meticulously, began to gather followers, attracting other outcasts and warriors drawn to his magnetic presence and his growing reputation for courage and generosity. A pivotal moment came when his young wife, Berta, was kidnapped by the rival Merkit tribe, a bitter echo of a raid his own father had once led. For a man on the steppe, such an event was the ultimate test of his strength and honour. Temujin could have accepted his loss, but he refused. With the help of his blood brother Jamuka and his patron Tohrul, he gathered a force, attacked the Merkit camp in a daring night raid, and rescued his wife. This victory was more than a personal triumph, it was a declaration. It announced the arrival of a new power on the steppe, a leader who repaid loyalty with loyalty, and who possessed the audacity and military skill to win against the odds. From this point forward, Temujin's ascent was relentless. He understood something that his rivals did not. He saw that the endless cycle of intertribal warfare was a prison, a system that bled the steppe of its strength and kept its people divided and weak. He envisioned something different, a single, unified nation, bound together not by the temporary ties of clan and blood, but by a new code of absolute loyalty to a single leader, himself. He began to systematically dismantle the old tribal structures. When he conquered a rival tribe, he did not simply absorb its warriors. He shattered its leadership, scattered its people amongst his own followers, and executed its aristocratic lines. This policy was brutal, but it was also revolutionary. It created a new kind of society, a meritocracy where a man's worth was determined not by his lineage, but by his skill and his loyalty to Temujin. A common shepherd could rise to become a general. The son of a blacksmith could command 1,000 men. This radical idea drew the best and brightest from across the steppe to his banner. He was building more than an army. He was building a people. His final rival was the one closest to him, his blood brother, Jamuka. Once allies, the two men represented two opposing philosophies. Jamuka believed in the old ways, in the traditional aristocratic order of the steppe. Temujin believed in the new order he was creating. Their rivalry split the steppe into two great camps, culminating in a series of decisive battles. In the end, Temujin's vision and his disciplined meritocratic army proved superior. Jamuka was captured, and in a final tragic meeting, he asked his old friend for a noble death, one without the spilling of blood. Temujin granted his request. With the death of Jamuka, his last great rival was gone. In the year 1206, on the banks of the Onon River, a great assembly, a Kurultai, of all the tribes of the steppe was called. There, they raised Temujin on a great white felt and proclaimed him the supreme ruler of all the peoples of the steppe. They gave him a new name, one that would echo through eternity. Genghis Khan, the oceanic or universal ruler. The scattered droplets of mercury had finally been brought together into one vast, terrifying and unstoppable mass. A new nation had been born. Now, as the undisputed master of Mongolia, Genghis Khan turned his gaze outward. The unification of the steppe was not an end, but a beginning. The formidable war machine he had built, this nation of warriors, could not be allowed to sit idle, lest it turn upon itself and shatter back into its constituent parts. It needed a purpose, a direction. And all around the newly unified Mongols lay ancient, wealthy, and seemingly vulnerable civilizations. The engine of conquest, once started, had to be fed. The first target was the kingdom of Western Xia to the south, a Tangut empire that controlled a vital portion of the lucrative Silk Road. This was the Mongols' first encounter with siege warfare, with the challenge of taking fortified cities. They were a people of the open field, masters of cavalry tactics, but city walls were an alien concept. They learned quickly, brutally and effectively. They learned to divert rivers, to enlist captured engineers, to use prisoners as human shields in their assaults. It was a grim and bloody education, but it was a successful one. The Western Xia were forced to submit, paying a heavy tribute and becoming a vassal state. With this first victory secured, Genghis Khan turned his attention to a far greater prize, the powerful Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin had long treated the nomads as inferior, demanding tribute and playing the tribes against one another. For Genghis Khan, this campaign was not just for plunder, it was for revenge and for prestige. In 1211, the Mongol horde, a river of horsemen perhaps 100,000 strong, poured south. The war against the Jin was a staggering undertaking. The Jin army vastly outnumbered the Mongols, and their lands were defended by massive fortified cities, culminating in the great capital of Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing. But the Mongols possessed advantages that the Jin could not counter: speed, discipline, and terror. The Mongol army was a force unlike any the world had ever seen. Every man was a warrior, trained from birth to ride and shoot a bow from the saddle with deadly accuracy. Their movements were not chaotic charges, but meticulously coordinated maneuvers, directed by a sophisticated system of signals using flags and drums. They perfected tactics of feigned retreat, of envelopment, of launching wave after wave of arrows to break an enemy's spirit before the final, devastating charge. And they wielded psychological warfare as their sharpest weapon. Cities that surrendered were often spared, their artisans and engineers folded into the Mongol machine. Cities that resisted faced annihilation. The message was simple and terrifying. Resistance was futile. In 1215, after a long and bitter siege, the great capital of Zhongdu fell. The conquest of the Jin would take decades more to complete, but this victory was a seismic event. It sent a shockwave across Asia. The seemingly primitive nomads had broken the back of one of the world's most powerful empires. The Mongols now had access to the vast wealth of China, and more importantly, to its vast pool of administrative and technical talent. They were no longer just a steppe horde. They were becoming a true imperial power. It was an event to the west, however, that would truly unleash the full, terrifying scope of Mongol ambition and fury. Genghis Khan had sought to establish trade relations with the Khwarezmian Empire, a vast and wealthy sultanate that stretched across Persia and Central Asia. He sent a trade caravan with diplomatic emissaries, seeking peaceful commerce. But the governor of a Khwarezmian border city, perhaps out of arrogance or greed, had the merchants killed and their goods seized. When Genghis Khan sent envoys to demand justice, the Shah of Khwarezmia foolishly had one of the envoys executed, and the others shaved in humiliation. This was more than an insult. In the Mongol worldview, it was a sacrilege. The person of an emissary was sacred. To harm one was to declare war not just on the Khan, but on the eternal blue sky itself. The response was cataclysmic. In 1219, Genghis Khan gathered the full might of his empire, an army of over 100,000 men, and launched a multi-pronged invasion of the Khwarezmian lands. This would not be a war of conquest for tribute. It would be a war of annihilation, a punitive expedition on a scale that beggared belief. The campaign that followed was a masterpiece of military strategy and a litany of unspeakable horror. The Mongol armies moved with a speed and coordination that seemed supernatural to their enemies. They crossed the supposedly impassable Kizilkum Desert to appear suddenly behind enemy lines, falling upon the great cities of the Silk Road like a bolt from the blue. One by one, the legendary centres of Islamic art, science and commerce were besieged and destroyed. Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to smouldering rubble, their populations systematically massacred. The accounts of chroniclers from the time speak of rivers running red with blood, of pyramids of skulls, of a silence that fell over lands that had once bustled with life. The destruction was not random. It was methodical. It was a demonstration. The Mongols were teaching the world a lesson in obedience, and the price of defiance was obliteration. The Shah of Khwarezmia was hounded across his own collapsing empire, dying a fugitive on a small island in the Caspian Sea, a ruler who had lost everything because he had underestimated the will of the Khan. In the wake of this devastating campaign, two of Genghis Khan's greatest generals, Jeba and Subutai, led a reconnaissance force of 20,000 men on one of the most remarkable cavalry expeditions in history. In what became known as the Great Raid, they swept west, looping around the Caspian Sea, defeating every army sent against them, from the Georgians in the Caucasus to a coalition of Rus princes on the plains of modern-day Ukraine. They rode for thousands of miles, mapping, scouting and terrorizing before returning east. They were the harbingers of the storm that was to come, the first tremor of the earthquake that would soon shake Europe to its very foundations. Genghis Khan had, in the span of 2 decades, transformed his world. He had united a people, built an unstoppable army, and carved out an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. But this empire was fundamentally different from any that had come before. It was not an empire of cities, for the Mongols viewed cities with suspicion, as places that softened men. It was not an empire defined by borders, but by horizons. It was, in its essence, an empire of motion. Its lifeblood was communication, and its skeleton was the horse. To hold together this vast, multicultural domain, Genghis Khan established one of the most ingenious logistical systems ever devised, the Yam. This was a vast network of relay stations set up roughly every 20 to 30 miles along the major routes of the empire. Each station was staffed and stocked with fresh horses, food and lodging. A rider carrying an imperial message, a pisa or medallion signifying his authority, could ride at full gallop to a station, exchange his exhausted horse for a fresh one, and continue on without a moment's delay. The Yam was the nervous system of the empire. It allowed messages, intelligence, and decrees to travel at a speed that was unheard of in the 13th century, over 200 miles a day. It meant that a general in Hungary could receive orders from the Great Khan in Mongolia in a matter of weeks. This incredible system bound the empire together, allowing for rapid deployment of troops, efficient administration, and a flow of information that gave the Mongols a decisive strategic advantage over their more sedentary and disconnected rivals. Genghis Khan also gave his people a written law code, the Yasa. While much of its content is now lost to history, its principles are clear. It was a strict pragmatic code that valued order and loyalty above all else. It forbade theft, adultery and betrayal, often punishing them with death. It mandated religious tolerance for all peaceful faiths, recognizing that a multi-ethnic empire could not be governed by a single creed. But its most important law was absolute obedience to the Khan. The Yasa transformed the Mongol Confederation from a collection of tribes into a state with a codified legal framework, a hardened skeleton that supported their vast commercial and military body. In 1227, during his final campaign against the rebellious Western Sia, Genghis Khan died. The cause of his death remains a mystery, perhaps from an illness or a fall from his horse. His body was returned to his homeland in Mongolia and buried in a secret, unmarked grave, its location forever lost to history, just as he had wished. He had laid the foundation. He had forged the weapon and shown his sons how to wield it. But the Mongol conquest was far from over. It was only just beginning. After a 2-year interregnum, His third son, the charismatic and politically astute Ögedei, was elected Great Khan. It was Ögedei who would give the burgeoning empire its first true capital, a city called Karakorum. It was less a city in the traditional sense and more of a sprawling cosmopolitan imperial camp, a testament to the empire's nomadic heart. But from this centre, Ögedei directed the next great wave of Mongol expansion, a coordinated multi-front assault on the rest of the world. One army, led by the brilliant General Subutai, was sent west, into Europe. This was the great invasion that would sear the name of the Mongols into the European consciousness. In the winter of 1240, the Mongols crossed the frozen rivers of the Rus principalities, sacking city after city, culminating in the utter destruction of Kiev, the mother of Rus cities. From there, they swept into Central Europe, a seemingly invincible force. In the spring of 1241, the Mongol armies shattered the combined forces of Poland and the Teutonic Knights at the Battle of Legnica. Just 2 days later, hundreds of miles to the south, Subutai orchestrated a masterful annihilation of the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi. The path into Western Europe, into a terrified and divided Christendom, lay open. The Mongol scouts were sighted just outside the walls of Vienna. It seemed as though nothing could stop them from riding all the way to the Atlantic. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they turned back. News had arrived from the distant capital of Karakorum. Ögedei Khan was dead. According to Mongol law, all princes of the bloodline had to return to the homeland to elect a new Great Khan. This succession crisis, this fatal flaw embedded in the Mongol political system, was the only thing that saved Europe from further conquest. The great tide of the Mongol advance receded, but it left behind a legacy of profound terror and a continent forever changed. While the great storm in the west subsided, another equally momentous struggle was unfolding in the east. Ögedei had not only sent his armies towards Europe, he had also renewed the war against the Jin dynasty in China. This was the unfinished business of his father, a campaign that would prove to be a long, grinding and brutal affair. The Jin were a formidable opponent, entrenched in a landscape of dense agriculture and massive technologically advanced cities, a world utterly alien to the Mongol horsemen. Here, the Mongol art of war had to evolve. Open-field battles, their specialty, were rare. Instead, the war became a relentless series of sieges. To overcome these fortresses, the Mongols became masters of appropriation. They conscripted vast armies of Chinese labourers, and most importantly Chinese and Persian engineers. Catapults, trebuchets, and sophisticated siege towers became a standard part of their arsenal. They even began to harness the power of gunpowder, using it to create explosive devices that could shatter gates and demoralize defenders. The nomadic horde was transforming into a sophisticated, multi-ethnic technological war machine. The final conquest of the Jin in 1234 was a monumental achievement, but it came at a staggering cost. Northern China was devastated, its population decimated by war, famine, and disease. Yet it was also a critical step in the Mongols' imperial education. It taught them the necessity of administration beyond simple plunder. A wise Khitan advisor named Yelu Chukai famously told Ögedei that while an empire could be conquered from horseback, it could not be ruled from horseback. He argued that a taxed and productive populace was infinitely more valuable than a wasteland of corpses. Ögedei listened, and the first seeds of a more permanent bureaucratic Mongol rule began to be sown in the fertile soil of China. Ögedei's reign represented the high summer of the unified Mongol Empire. He was a generous and convivial ruler, known for his love of drink and grand construction projects. Under his direction, the capital at Karakorum was transformed from a collection of tents into a genuine, if rustic, imperial city. It became a vibrant, cosmopolitan hub, a place where Buddhist monks, Nestorian Christians, Muslim merchants and Taoist sages mingled under the watchful eye of the Great Khan. It was the still point at the centre of a turning world, the heart from which the arteries of the Yam pulsed, carrying commands to the farthest reaches of their dominion. But this empire, which seemed to the outside world a monolithic and unstoppable force, rested on a fragile and dangerous promise, the unity of the house of Genghis Khan. The sons and grandsons of the conqueror were a proud, ambitious, and often fiercely competitive family. Genghis Khan himself had divided the empire into appanages, or uluses, for each of his 4 sons, Jochi, Chagatai, Ogadei, and Tolui. While he was alive, his immense authority kept their rivalries in check. After his death, and especially after the death of his chosen successor Ogadei in 1241, these latent fissures began to crack open. The death of Ogadei was not just a reprieve for Europe, it was a constitutional crisis for the empire. The succession was not automatic. It required a Kurultai, an assembly of the Mongol princes, to elect a new great Khan. This process could take months, even years, and during that time the empire was effectively headless. In this power vacuum, the formidable and politically savvy wife of Ogadei, Turagana Khatun, seized the regency. For 5 years, she ruled the empire, skillfully manoeuvring through the treacherous currents of Mongol politics to ensure the eventual election of her own son, Guyuk. When Guyuk was finally enthroned in 1246, the strains on imperial unity were already becoming apparent. The Grand Kurultai that elected him was a magnificent display of Mongol power, attended by emissaries from across Eurasia, including the papal envoy John of Plano Karpini, who left a priceless, if terrified, account of the Mongol court. But one key figure was conspicuously absent: Batu Khan, ruler of the westernmost Ulus, the Golden Horde. Batu, a grandson of Jochi, was Guyuk's cousin and his bitter rival. He refused to pay homage, a clear sign that the central authority of the great Khan was beginning to fray. Guyuk's reign was short and tense. He was a stern ruler, and he sought to reverse his mother's policies and reassert his own authority. A confrontation with the recalcitrant Batu seemed inevitable. In 1248, Guyuk was marching west with a large army, ostensibly for a campaign, but it was widely believed his true target was Batu himself. A civil war between the cousins, one that could have torn the empire in two, seemed imminent. But before the armies could meet, Guyuk Khan died suddenly, perhaps of illness, perhaps of poison. The empire was once again plunged into uncertainty. What happened next was not just a succession, it was a revolution. The regency passed to Guyuk's widow, but the real power lay with another formidable woman, Sorghaghtani Beki, the widow of Tolui, Genghis Khan's youngest son. Sorghaghtani was one of the most remarkable figures of her age, intelligent, politically brilliant, and a master of statecraft. She had managed her late husband's appanage with incredible skill, making it the wealthiest and best-run domain in the empire. She was also a Nestorian Christian, a fact that highlights the surprising religious diversity within the Mongol ruling family. Sorghaghtani recognized that the line of Ogadei was weakening, and she saw an opportunity to advance the claims of her own sons. She formed a powerful political alliance with Batu Khan in the west, who despised the house of Ogadei. Together, they orchestrated a political coup. They convened a Kurultai in their own territory, and, despite protests from the descendants of Ogadei and Chagatai, elected Sorghaghtani's eldest son Mongol as the new great Khan in 1251. This was the Toluid Revolution. Mongol swiftly and ruthlessly consolidated his power. He launched a brutal purge of his political opponents, executing dozens of high-ranking princes and commanders from the rival lines. The House of Ogadei was shattered, its power broken forever. The throne of the great Khan had passed to the sons of Tolui, where it would remain. While this act secured Mongol's rule, it came at a high cost. It entrenched the bitter rivalries between the different branches of the family, poisoning the well of imperial unity, and setting the stage for the empire's eventual formal dissolution. Mongol Khan was perhaps the last of the great Khans to rule over a truly unified, centrally administered empire. He was a stern, disciplined, and deeply conservative ruler who sought to restore the principles of his grandfather Genghis Khan. He was known for his sobriety, a stark contrast to the alcoholism that plagued many of his relatives, and his sense of justice. He reformed the empire's finances, ordered a new census of the entire domain from China to Russia, and sought to curb the corruption that had spread under his predecessors. From his capital at Karakoram, Mongol envisioned a second great wave of Mongol conquest. a final push to fulfill the divine mandate of the eternal blue sky to rule the entire world. He gave his two younger brothers command over the two most important military expeditions of the age. To his brother Kublai, he gave the task of completing the conquest of China, focusing on the powerful and resilient Southern Song dynasty, and to his other brother Hulagu, he gave a mission that would echo with fire and blood through the heartlands of the Islamic world. Hulagu's campaign was one of the largest and best-equipped military ventures the Mongols had ever assembled. He was given a fifth of the empire's total military strength, a vast, multi-ethnic army that included contingents from every part of the Mongol domain. His mandate was clear: to march west, destroy the rebellious Nizari Ismaili sect, also known to the west as the Assassins, and then to demand the submission of the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. It was a campaign that would irrevocably alter the course of Middle Eastern history. The first target, the Assassins, had been a thorn in the side of powers in the region for over a century. From their network of impregnable mountain fortresses, most famously Alamut in northern Persia, they had conducted a campaign of political assassination against their enemies. To the Mongols, they represented an affront to legitimate authority. Hulagu's army, armed with the most advanced siege technology from China, began a systematic reduction of the assassin strongholds. One by one, the fortresses that had been considered unconquerable fell. In 1256, Alamut itself surrendered, its legendary library and fortifications put to the torch. With the assassins eliminated, Hulagu turned his gaze towards the grandest prize of all, Baghdad. For 500 years, Baghdad had been the symbolic heart of the Islamic world, the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. Though its political power had waned, it remained a city of immense prestige, a centre of learning, culture and wealth. The Caliph, Al-Mustasim, was a weak and arrogant ruler. He fatally underestimated the Mongol threat, responding to Hulagu's demand for submission with a mixture of defiance and bluster, believing the city's walls and the sanctity of his office would protect him. In late 1257, the Mongol armies converged on Baghdad, encamping on both sides of the Tigris River. The siege began in January 1258. The Caliph's army was small and poorly led. A sortie from the city was easily defeated and trapped by the rising floodwaters of the Tigris after the Mongols destroyed the dikes. Soon the city was completely encircled, bombarded day and night by a fearsome array of siege engines. The noise of the bombardment, it was said, was like the roaring of 1,000 thunders. After less than 2 weeks of this terrifying assault, the city's outer walls were breached. The Caliph, seeing his cause was hopeless, attempted to negotiate, but it was too late. Hulagu was in no mood for mercy. On February 10th, the Caliph surrendered. 3 days later, the Mongol army was unleashed upon the city. The week of sacking that followed is one of the darkest episodes in the history of civilization. What happened in Baghdad was not just a massacre, it was the destruction of a world. Hundreds of thousands of its inhabitants were slaughtered. The city's great mosques, palaces and markets were looted and burned. The most devastating loss was the destruction of the Grand Library of Baghdad, the legendary House of Wisdom. It was the single greatest repository of knowledge in the Arab world, containing countless precious manuscripts on medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and mathematics from across the known world. It was said that the waters of the Tigris ran black with the ink of the books thrown into it, and red with the blood of the scholars who were killed. The Caliph himself was executed in a manner befitting Mongol tradition for a sovereign. Spared the spilling of his royal blood, he was rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. With his death, the 5-century-old Abbasid Caliphate was extinguished. The fall of Baghdad was a psychological blow from which the Islamic world would not recover for centuries. It was the end of an era, a cataclysm that marked the definitive end of the Islamic Golden Age. The centre of the Islamic world would shift away from the Arab heartlands to Egypt and Anatolia. From the smoking ruins of Baghdad, Hulagu marched on into Syria, capturing Aleppo and Damascus. The Mongol advance seemed unstoppable. It looked as if all of Islam, from Persia to the Mediterranean, would fall under their dominion. The next logical target was the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, the last major Muslim power in the region. But just as Hulagu was preparing his invasion, history intervened once more. A messenger arrived from the east, bearing the news that the great Khan Munka had died during his campaign in China. This news changed everything. The death of the great Khan triggered another succession crisis. Hulagu, as a prince of the royal blood, had to secure his own position and influence the coming election. He withdrew the bulk of his army back towards Persia, leaving only a smaller token force in Syria under his general Kitbuka. This withdrawal created a critical window of opportunity for the Mamluks of Egypt. The Mamluks were a formidable military power, a dynasty founded by former Turkic slave soldiers who were themselves a product of the steppe. They understood Mongol tactics in a way that the Arabs and Persians had not. Led by the brilliant Sultan Qutuz and his general Baybars, the Mamluks advanced into Palestine to confront the Mongol garrison. In September of 1260, at a place called Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, the two armies met. The Battle of Ain Jalut was a pivotal turning point in world history. The Mamluks, using a tactic of feigned retreat very similar to that of the Mongols themselves, lured the Mongol force into a trap and then crushed them with a powerful counterattack. The Mongol general, Kitbuka, was captured and executed. For the very first time, a major Mongol army had been decisively defeated in a pitched battle. The aura of Mongol invincibility was shattered. The victory at Ain Jalut had profound consequences. It halted the Mongol advance westward, permanently. The Mamluk Sultanate would not only survive, but would become the dominant power in the Middle East for the next 2 centuries, the guardians of the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. The defeat, though small in terms of the numbers involved, marked the high water mark of the Mongol Empire. It established a frontier, a line in the sand of the Sinai Desert that the Mongol tide would never cross. The world was not, after all, destined to be ruled by a single Khan. While Hulagu's campaign was redrawing the map of the Middle East, his brother Kublai was engaged in an even longer and more arduous struggle in the Far East. The conquest of the southern Song dynasty was the Mongols' single greatest military challenge. The Song were wealthy, technologically advanced, and ruled over a population of more than 60 million people. Their territory was a landscape of mountains, rivers and rice paddies, ill-suited to Mongol cavalry warfare. It was a war that would last for over 4 decades. Kublai, unlike many of his Mongol peers, was a pragmatist who possessed a deep fascination with Chinese culture. He understood that to conquer China, he had to become, in some ways, Chinese. He surrounded himself with Chinese advisors, adopted Chinese methods of administration, and showed a respect for Confucian scholarship. This approach was critical to winning over segments of the Chinese populace and governing the territories he conquered effectively. It also put him at odds with the more traditionalist Mongol faction at court, who saw this Sinicization as a betrayal of their nomadic heritage. The war against the Song was a brutal slog, a war of attrition defined by epic sieges of massive, well-defended cities. The most famous of these was the siege of Xiangyang and Fancheng, twin cities that guarded the approach to the Yangtze River. The siege lasted for 5 years, from 1268 to 1273. It was a showcase of the most advanced siege engineering of the 13th century, with the Mongols, under Kublai's direction, employing Muslim engineers from Persia to construct powerful counterweight trebuchets that could hurl massive stones and shatter the city walls. The eventual fall of these cities broke the back of the Song defence. With the gateway to the south open, the Mongol armies and their newly built navy swept down the Yangtze. The Song court was in disarray, plagued by weak leadership and internal divisions. In 1276, the Song capital of Hangzhou, one of the largest and most magnificent cities in the world, surrendered without a fight. The Dowager Empress and the young child emperor were taken captive and sent north to Kublai's court, where they were treated with respect. Still, loyalist remnants of the Song court fought on, retreating ever southward with 2 young princes. Their desperate resistance culminated in 1279 at the Battle of Yarman, a massive naval engagement off the coast of modern-day Guangdong. The Song fleet, though vast, was outmaneuvered and destroyed by the Mongol navy. A loyal Song minister, seeing that all was lost, took the 8-year-old last emperor in his arms and leaped into the sea, choosing death over surrender. With this tragic act, the Song dynasty, after more than 3 centuries of brilliant cultural and technological achievement, was extinguished. For the first time in over 300 years, China was unified under a single ruler. But that ruler was not a Han Chinese son of heaven. He was a Mongol Khan. In 1271, even before the final victory, Kublai had formally proclaimed the founding of a new dynasty, with a Chinese dynastic name, the Yuan. He established a grand new capital on the site of the old Jin capital, calling it Dadu, the Great Capital, known to later travellers like Marco Polo as Cambaluc. This city would become the nucleus for the modern city of Beijing. The death of Mongol Khan in 1259 had not just interrupted the campaigns in the west, it had triggered the final irreparable fracture of the Mongol Empire. While Kublai was in China, his younger brother, Arik Burke, who was in charge of the homeland in Karakoram, had himself elected Great Khan, with the support of the Mongol traditionalists. Kublai responded by having his own Kurultai in China, also proclaiming him Great Khan. The result was a bitter 4-year civil war between the two brothers. Kublai, with the immense resources of China at his disposal, eventually triumphed. Arik Burke surrendered in 1264. But the victory was a hollow one for imperial unity. During the war, the other Khans of the empire had chosen sides or simply asserted their own independence. Burke Khan of the Golden Horde had sided with Arik Burke. Hulagu in Persia had sided with Kublai. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia descended into its own internal conflicts. The concept of a single, unified Mongol empire ruled by one great Khan from Karakoram was dead. From this point forward, the Mongol world consisted of 4 separate, independent and often warring successor states. There was the Yuan dynasty in China and Mongolia, ruled by Kublai and his descendants. There was the Ilkhanate in Persia, ruled by Hulagu and his line. There was the Golden Horde in the Russian steppes, ruled by the House of Jochi. And there was the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the traditional Mongol heartland. While they still acknowledged a nominal familial link, they were for all practical purposes independent empires, each with its own destiny. Kublai Khan, as the emperor of the Yuan dynasty, was the most powerful of these rulers. His reign represented a fascinating and complex fusion of Mongol martial heritage and Chinese civilization. He was a grand figure, a man of enormous appetites and even greater ambitions. He presided over a vast multicultural empire that was, for a time, the most powerful and prosperous state on earth. His court at Dadu was a spectacle of wealth and power, attracting merchants, missionaries and adventurers from all corners of the known world. The most famous of these visitors was, of course, the Venetian merchant Marco Polo, whose vivid and often fantastical account of his years in Kublai's service would shape Europe's perception of China for centuries. Polo described the magnificent palaces of Dadu, the efficient workings of the imperial postal system, the yam, the use of paper money, and the sheer scale and order of Yuan society. To a Europe of small, warring feudal states, Kublai's empire seemed like something from another world, a realm of unimaginable wealth and absolute power. To govern his vast Chinese domain, Kublai implemented a rigid social hierarchy. At the very top were the Mongols themselves, a privileged military aristocracy. Below them were their non-Chinese allies, a diverse group of peoples known as the Semu Ren, or people with coloured eyes, who included Turks, Persians and even Europeans like the Polos. These foreigners were often employed as administrators and tax collectors, as Kublai trusted them more than his Chinese subjects. The third rank was occupied by the northern Chinese, and at the very bottom were the southern Chinese of the former Song dynasty, who were the most numerous and the most discriminated against. This system was practical from a Mongol perspective, but it bred deep and lasting resentment among the Chinese population. Despite Kublai's personal interest in Chinese culture, the Yuan rulers always remained in some sense outsiders. They struggled to bridge the immense cultural gap between their own nomadic traditions and the deeply entrenched bureaucratic and agricultural civilization of China. They were rulers of China, but they never truly became Chinese. Kublai's ambition did not end at the borders of China. As the Great Khan, he believed he held the mandate of heaven over all the world. he launched two of the most ambitious and ultimately disastrous naval invasions in history, both aimed at the island nation of Japan. The samurai warriors of Japan were formidable fighters, but they had never faced an enemy like the Mongols. In 1274, the first invasion fleet, a massive armada of Mongol, Chinese and Korean ships, landed on Japanese shores. The samurai fought fiercely, but they were shocked by the Mongols' tactics, their use of massed formations, poison-tipped arrows, and exploding bombs. The Mongols were on the verge of a breakthrough when a sudden ferocious storm descended upon the fleet as it lay at anchor. The armada was scattered and destroyed. The Japanese believed this storm was a divine wind, a kamikaze, sent by the gods to protect their sacred islands. Undeterred, Kublai spent years building an even larger invasion force. In 1281, he launched a second, even more massive armada against Japan, one of the largest naval forces the world had ever seen. Once again, the Japanese defenders fought with desperate courage, holding the invaders on the beaches for weeks, and once again, as the campaign hung in the balance, a powerful typhoon swept in from the sea and annihilated the Mongol fleet. This second kamikaze cemented the Japanese belief in their own divine protection and marked the definitive end of Kublai's ambitions to conquer them. The Mongol war machine, so invincible on land, had found its limit at the edge of the sea. Similar costly failures followed in campaigns against Vietnam and Java, where the Mongol armies were defeated not by superior forces, but by tropical diseases, dense jungles, and determined guerrilla resistance. These failed expeditions were an immense drain on the Yuan treasury and a blow to the prestige of Mongol arms. They signalled that the era of relentless expansion was over. The Yuan dynasty had reached the natural limits of its power. After Kublai's long and brilliant reign ended with his death in 1294, the Yuan dynasty he had founded entered a long period of decline. His successors lacked his vision and his political skill. The court was plagued by weak rulers, short reigns, and destructive factional infighting. The Mongol princes fought amongst themselves for power, while the complex administrative machinery of the empire began to break down. Economic problems mounted. The lavish spending of the court, combined with the costly military failures, led to rampant inflation as the government printed paper money with reckless abandon. A series of natural disasters in the 14th century, floods, droughts, and famines, were interpreted by the Chinese populace as a sign that the Yuan had lost the mandate of heaven. And lurking beneath it all was the devastating impact of the Black Death, which ravaged China in the 1330s and 40s, killing millions and further destabilizing the foundations of Mongol rule. This confluence of political decay, economic hardship, and natural catastrophe created a fertile ground for rebellion. Across the countryside, peasant uprisings began to erupt, often led by charismatic figures from millenarian Buddhist sects. The most significant of these was the Red Turban Rebellion, which began in the 1350s. Out of this chaotic and widespread revolt, a peasant leader of extraordinary ability named Zhu Yuanzhang emerged. Zhu Yuanzhang methodically defeated his rival rebel leaders and then turned his unified forces against the weakened Yuan. In 1368, his armies advanced on the capital, Dadu. The last Yuan emperor, Togon Temür, did not even attempt a defence. He fled the city, abandoning China and retreating with his court back to the ancestral homeland of the Mongolian steppe. It was a remarkably peaceful end to nearly a century of Mongol rule. Zhu Yuanzhang entered the capital, declared the founding of a new dynasty, the Ming, and became the Hongwu emperor. The mandate of heaven had passed back into Chinese hands. Meanwhile, in the western half of the fractured empire, Hulagu's descendants ruled over the domain he had carved out in Persia, a state known as the Ilkhanate. This new Mongol kingdom faced a unique challenge. Unlike their cousins in China, who ruled over a relatively homogeneous population, or their kin in Russia who ruled from a distance, the Mongol rulers of the Ilkhanate were a small alien elite ruling directly over a vast, sophisticated, and deeply rooted Islamic civilization. The central question of their rule was one of identity. Would they remain Mongol, or would they become Persian? The early Ilkhans, including Hulagu himself, followed the traditional Mongol path of religious tolerance. though they personally tended to favour Buddhism and Nestorian Christianity, partly due to the influence of their wives. This created an undercurrent of tension with their overwhelmingly Muslim subjects. For several decades, the Ilkhanate existed in a state of cultural suspension, a Mongol court superimposed upon a Persian society, with two worlds living side by side but never truly merging. This tension was exacerbated by constant warfare with their neighbours, the Mamluks in the west and the Golden Horde to the north, whose ruler, Berka Khan, had converted to Islam and declared a holy war on Hulagu for the destruction of Baghdad. The decisive turning point came in 1295, with the accession of a new ruler, Ghazan Khan. Ghazan was a remarkable figure, a man of great intellect and energy, who recognised that the old way was unsustainable. He understood that to rule Persia effectively, the Mongols had to embrace the culture and faith of their subjects. He made a dramatic public conversion to Islam and ordered the entire Mongol nobility to follow his example. Ghazan's conversion was a profound political act. It bridged the cultural and religious chasm between the rulers and the ruled. It legitimised Mongol rule in the eyes of their Persian subjects and transformed the Ilkhanate from a foreign military occupation into a legitimate Persianate Islamic dynasty. Ghazan, supported by his brilliant Persian vizier, Rashid al-Din launched a sweeping series of reforms, tackling everything from taxation and land ownership to the legal system and the currency. He brought a period of much-needed stability and prosperity to a land that had been ravaged by decades of conquest and mismanagement. This period, under Ghazan and his successor Oljetu, marked the golden age of the Ilkhanate. It was a time of extraordinary cultural and scientific flowering, a testament to the regenerative power of civilization. The Ilkhans became lavish patrons of the arts and sciences. At the Great Observatory at Maragay, which had been founded by Hulagu, astronomers continued to do groundbreaking work that would later influence European scientists like Copernicus. Under the patronage of the court, the art of the Persian miniature reached new heights of beauty and sophistication, blending traditional Persian styles with Chinese artistic influences that had flowed west along the Silk Road. And it was at the Ilkhanid court that the vizier Rashid al-Din compiled his monumental Jami al-Tawarikh, or Compendium of Chronicles, the first true world history, which detailed the history not only of the Mongols and Persians, but also of the Chinese, Indians and Europeans. It was a product of the unique global perspective that the Mongol Empire had created. The Ilkhanate, however, shared the same fatal weakness as the other Mongol successor states: a fragile system of succession. After the death of the last strong ruler, Abu Sa'id, in 1335, the kingdom fell into a prolonged and chaotic civil war. Rival Mongol factions, Turkish warlords, and Persian noble families vied for power, tearing the Ilkhanate apart. Within a few decades, the unified state that Hulagu had founded had disintegrated into a patchwork of smaller, warring principalities. The great Mongol experiment in Persia had come to an end, not with a foreign invasion, but with a collapse from within. To the north of the Ilkhanate, across the Caucasus Mountains, lay the vast domains of the Golden Horde. Founded by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, this Khanate ruled over the vast steppes of what is now southern Russia and Kazakhstan. Their relationship with the peoples they conquered, particularly the principalities of the Rus, was unique among the Mongol successor states. They did not seek to rule directly or to occupy the northern forests where the Rus lived. Instead, they established a system of vassalage, what would later be known as the Mongol yoke. The Rus princes were allowed to rule their own lands, but they were forced to pay a heavy annual tribute to the Khan in his great capital city of Sarai on the Volga River. To be confirmed as a ruler, each prince had to undertake a long and humiliating journey to Sarai, and sometimes even to Karakorum, to receive a patent of office, the Yarlik, from their Mongol overlords. The Mongols were the ultimate arbiters of power, and they frequently played the princes against one another to keep them weak and divided. Any prince who defied their authority faced a swift and brutal punitive expedition from the horde. For over 2 centuries, this system locked the Rus' principalities into a state of political subordination. It also had the profound effect of cutting them off from their traditional ties to Byzantium and Western Europe, reorienting their political and cultural gaze eastward, towards the steppe. The city of Kiev, the ancient centre of Rus' civilization, never recovered from its destruction in 1240. Power slowly shifted northward to new centres that were better able to navigate the complex world of Mongol politics. The Golden Horde, like the Ilkhanate, also underwent a religious transformation. Batu's successor, Berka Khan, was the first of the major Mongol rulers to convert to Islam. This decision was driven partly by personal faith and partly by political calculation. It helped him to solidify alliances with the Mamluks of Egypt against their common enemy, the Ilkhanate, and it gave the Horde a stronger cultural identity. Over time, the Mongol elite of the Horde became increasingly Turkified and Islamicized, blending with the Turkic Kipchak peoples who formed the majority of the steppe population. The Golden Horde grew immensely wealthy by controlling the northern termini of the Silk Road and the lucrative trade in furs and slaves that flowed out of the Russian forests. Their capital at Sarai became a sprawling multi-ethnic metropolis, a major centre of international commerce. But like its sister Khanates, the Horde was plagued by internal instability. In the latter half of the 14th century, it was racked by a period of intense civil war known as the Great Troubles, during which Khans rose and fell with dizzying speed. This internal weakness provided an opportunity for their vassals. The Grand Princes of Moscow, who had been granted the profitable role of chief tribute collectors for the Mongols, steadily grew in power and influence. In 1380, Prince Dmitry Donskoy of Moscow led a united Russian army to a major victory over a Mongol force at the Battle of Kulikovo. Although the victory was not decisive, the Mongols would return to sack Moscow 2 years later. It was a powerful symbolic blow. It shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility in Russia and proved that the Horde could be defeated by a united Rus army. The final devastating blow to the Golden Horde came not from their Russian vassals, but from another conqueror who claimed the mantle of Genghis Khan. In the late 14th century, a Turco-Mongol warlord named Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, rose from the remnants of the Chagatai Khanate. In a series of brilliant and incredibly destructive campaigns, Timur shattered the power of the Golden Horde, sacking its major cities, including Sarai, and destroying its economic base. The Horde never recovered. It broke apart into several smaller rival Khanates, the Khanates of Crimea, Astrakhan and Kazan. The years-long Mongol dominion over Russia was effectively over, leaving the Grand Duchy of Moscow as the undisputed heir to power in the region. The fourth and final of the great successor states was the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. It was, in many ways, the most conservative and the most traditionally Mongol of the four. Occupying the arid steppes and oases that had been the cradle of many nomadic empires, the Chagatai rulers long resisted the pull of sedentary life. The Khanate was defined by a near-constant tension between two factions, those who advocated for embracing Islam and urban life, and those who fiercely clung to the nomadic traditions and the laws of the Yasa. This internal conflict meant the Chagatai Khanate was often politically fragmented and unstable. However, its strategic location astride the central trunk of the Silk Road meant that it remained a crucial player in Eurasian commerce. It was the geographic heart of the old empire, the bridge that connected the Yuan dynasty in the east with the Ilkhanate in the west. When its rulers were strong, trade flourished. When they were weak, the vital arteries of communication and commerce were severed. It was from the crucible of the collapsing Chagatai Khanate that Timur would emerge to build his own short-lived but terrifying empire. Taken together, the century of dominance by these four Khanates, from roughly 1250 to 1350, created a unique period in world history. Despite their political divisions and frequent wars, the shared legacy of Genghis Khan and the vast, unified space his conquests had opened up created an era of unprecedented continental connection. Historians call this period the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. It was a peace born of conquest, a stability enforced by the terror of the Mongol bow, but it was a peace nonetheless. For the first time in history, a single political and military power controlled the entire length of the Silk Road, from the shores of the Black Sea to the coast of the Pacific. The old patchwork of kingdoms and toll booths that had made long-distance travel dangerous and expensive was swept away. The Mongols policed the trade routes with ruthless efficiency. They built and maintained the Yam postal system, and they punished banditry with death. The result was an explosion of trade and travel between East and West. It was said that a maiden carrying a sack of gold could travel from one end of the empire to the other without fear of being molested. While an exaggeration, it captures the essential truth of the era. Caravans laden with silk, spices, ceramics, and other precious goods moved freely across the continent. The journey of Marco Polo and his family from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan and back would have been unthinkable before the rise of the Mongols. So too would the travels of the great Moroccan scholar Ibn Battuta, who journeyed through the lands of the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde on his way to India and China. This was more than just a movement of goods. It was a movement of peoples, ideas and technologies. The Mongol courts were cosmopolitan melting pots. Persian astronomers and physicians found work in China. Chinese engineers brought their advanced siegecraft to Persia. Italian merchants established trading posts in the Crimea and on the shores of the Caspian Sea. Nestorian Christian missionaries like Rabban Sauma, a Turkic monk born near Beijing, travelled from China all the way to the courts of Paris and Rome as a diplomat for the Ilkhan. The consequences of this global exchange were profound and world-changing. Gunpowder, a Chinese invention, made its way west, where it would eventually revolutionise European warfare and help to end the age of the feudal knight. The magnetic compass, printing technology, and even playing cards also made the journey. From the Middle East, knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, and medicine flowed both east and west. It was an era of true globalization, a 13th century World Wide Web connected by camel caravans and Mongol horsemen. But this interconnected world had a dark side. The same routes that carried silk and silver could also carry disease. In the 1330s, a new and terrifying plague, the bubonic plague, erupted in Central Asia or China. Carried by fleas-on rats that infested the grain sacks and luggage of the caravans, the pestilence began to spread along the trade routes of the Mongol Empire. The Pax Mongolica, which had created the conditions for the world's greatest commercial network, now became the vector for the world's most devastating pandemic. By the 1340s, the plague had reached the lands of the Golden Horde. In 1347, during a siege of the Genoese trading port of Kaffa in the Crimea, the Mongol army was struck by the disease. In a horrifying early instance of biological warfare, the Mongol commander ordered the corpses of plague victims to be catapulted over the city walls. Fleeing Genoese ships carried the plague back with them to Italy, and from there, the Black Death exploded across Europe, killing as much as half of the continent's population in just a few years. It was a cataclysm that shattered the medieval world. The interconnectedness forged by the Mongols had come at a terrible, unforeseen price. The story of the Mongol Empire is therefore a story of profound and startling contradictions. They were the most brutally destructive force of their age, a storm that swept away entire civilizations and left pyramids of skulls in its wake. The fall of Baghdad, the razing of Samarkand, the depopulation of northern China. These were human tragedies on an almost unimaginable scale. And yet, from this devastation, they created a moment of unprecedented global unity, a vast zone of peace and commerce that linked the great civilizations of Eurasia more closely than ever before. They were a nomadic people who held a deep-seated distrust for cities, yet they became the rulers of the most magnificent urban centres on Earth. They were illiterate pastoralists who founded one of the most administratively complex empires in history. They adhered to a shamanistic faith in the eternal blue sky, yet they presided over a multicultural domain where Christianity, Islam and Buddhism all flourished, and they themselves would eventually adopt the religions of the peoples they had conquered. The legacy of Genghis Khan is not a simple tale of barbarism versus civilization. It is a far more complex story about transformation, connection, and the sheer, astonishing impact that a determined people from the peripheries of the world could have upon its centre. In less than a century, they had taken their world of felt tents and endless grasslands and stretched it to encompass nearly all the known world, shattering old orders and creating the conditions for a new one to emerge. The world forged by Genghis Khan was a world of terror and of opportunity, a world of destruction and of creation, a world brought violently and for a fleeting moment together. The collapse of the Mongol Khanates in the mid-14th century did not mark the end of Mongol influence, but rather its transformation. The power they had projected was like a great river that, upon meeting an obstacle, breaks into a delta of 100 smaller streams. The descendants of Genghis Khan and the Turco-Mongol warrior elites he had raised to prominence continued to shape the destinies of vast regions for centuries to come. They were the ghost in the machine of Eurasian politics, the standard against which all future aspirants to empire in the region would measure themselves. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the rise of the last great nomadic conqueror to emerge from Central Asia, Timur or Tamerlane. Born in 1336 near Samarkand in the fragmenting Chagatai Khanate, Timur was a product of the Turco-Mongol world the conquest had created. He was not a direct descendant of Genghis Khan in the male line, a fact that legally barred him from claiming the title of Khan for himself. Instead, he ruled through a series of puppet Chagatai Khans, adopting the more modest title of Emir, or commander. Yet, in his ambition, his military genius, and his terrifying ruthlessness, he was the true heir to the Mongol conqueror. Timur's life was a whirlwind of ceaseless campaigning. He saw himself as a restorer, a man destined to reunite the fractured Mongol Empire under his own iron fist. He spent decades consolidating his power base in Central Asia, making the city of Samarkand his capital and embarking on a building program of breathtaking scale and beauty. He gathered the finest artisans and architects from across the lands he conquered and turned Samarkand into the jewel of the Islamic world, a city of turquoise domes, towering minarets, and majestic madrasas. It was to be the worthy centre of his new world order. From this magnificent base, Timur launched a series of campaigns that were, if anything, even more destructive than those of his predecessors. He did not seek to build a lasting administrative state in the lands he conquered. He sought to neutralise any and all potential rivals, to drain their wealth for the glorification of Samarkand, and to leave behind a legacy of terror that would ensure no one would dare to challenge him. He invaded Persia, shattering the petty dynasties that had succeeded the Ilkhans. He marched on India, sacking Delhi and slaughtering its population. His most devastating campaigns were directed against his fellow inheritors of the Mongol legacy. He saw the Golden Horde as a rival and a threat. In a series of massive invasions in the 1390s, he crushed the armies of the Horde, pursued its Khan Toktamish deep into the Russian winter, and systematically destroyed its primary cities, including the great trade emporium of Sarai. He deliberately wrecked the Horde's control of the northern trade routes, redirecting the flow of commerce through his own domains. The Golden Horde, already weakened by internal strife, never recovered from this blow. Timur had cannibalized one part of the Mongol heritage to strengthen his own. His most famous campaign came in 1402, against another rising power, the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Sultan, Bayezid the Fayed, had been carving out a formidable empire in Anatolia and the Balkans. The two great conquerors traded insults through letters before their armies finally met near the city of Ankara. In a tactical masterpiece, Timur's forces enveloped and destroyed the Ottoman army. Sultan Bayezid himself was captured, a humiliation from which he never recovered, dying in captivity shortly after. The Ottoman Empire was thrown into a civil war, and its expansion was halted for a generation. For a brief moment, Timur stood as the undisputed master of the entire Middle East. In 1404, at the age of nearly 70, Timur embarked on his final and most ambitious campaign, the conquest of Ming China. It was to be the ultimate prize, the restoration of the Yuan legacy that his Mongol heroes had lost. He assembled a colossal army and marched east during the harsh Central Asian winter. But the eternal blue sky, which had favoured Genghis Khan, had other plans for Timur. In February 1405, while encamped in what is now Kazakhstan, Timur fell ill and died. His empire, unlike that of Genghis Khan, was a purely personal creation, held together by his own military genius and fearsome reputation. It lacked the institutional framework and the shared sense of purpose that had allowed the Mongol Empire to survive its founder. Upon Timur's death, his vast domain immediately began to crumble as his sons and grandsons fell to fighting amongst themselves. His legacy was twofold: the architectural splendour of Samarkand and a trail of destruction that stretched from Delhi to Damascus. He was a brilliant, terrifying echo of the great Mongol conquests, but an echo nonetheless. Yet, the legacy of both Genghis and Timur endured in a more concrete political form. One of Timur's descendants, a prince named Babur, was driven out of Central Asia by his rivals in the early 16th century. Seeking a new kingdom, he turned his small army south towards India. At the Battle of Panipat in 1526, using innovative tactics involving firearms and artillery, Babur defeated the massive army of the Delhi Sultanate. He went on to establish a new empire in India, one that would become known to the world as the Mughal Empire. The word Mughal is simply the Persian word for Mongol. For over 300 years, the descendants of Timur and Genghis Khan would rule over the Indian subcontinent, creating a legacy of stunning art, architecture, and a unique synthesis of Persian, Mongol, and Indian cultures. In Persia, while the Timurid Empire fragmented, its cultural influence persisted, fostering a brilliant renaissance in art and literature. In Russia, the final remnants of the Golden Horde, the successor Khanates, were slowly but surely absorbed by the rising power of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. In 1480, Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, formally renounced his allegiance to the Horde in an event known as the Great Stand on the Ugra River. It was a largely symbolic, bloodless confrontation, but it marked the definitive end of the Mongol yoke. The new Russian state, centred in Moscow, had been forged in the crucible of Mongol domination, its political structures, military tactics, and even its census and postal systems bearing the deep imprint of its former overlords. And what of the Mongols themselves, the people who had started it all? After their expulsion from China, the Yuan court retreated to Mongolia, where they formed what is known as the Northern Yuan dynasty. They reverted to their nomadic ways, a shadow of their former imperial glory, but still a formidable power on the steppe. For centuries they would remain a threat to the Ming dynasty in China, launching raids and engaging in a long-running, low-level conflict along the Great Wall. The dream of reconquering their lost empire never fully died. The great empire of Genghis Khan was gone, shattered into 1,000 pieces, but its memory lingered, shaping the world that came after. The lines on the modern map of Asia are, in many ways, a direct result of the divisions of the Mongol Empire. The brutal conquests had the unintended effect of creating new political and cultural entities. The destruction of the old world of Kievan Rus and the Abbasid Caliphate paved the way for the rise of Moscow and the Ottoman Turks. The century of the Pax Mongolica, for all its horrors, had fundamentally altered the trajectory of world history. It had pulled the separate pockets of civilization in Eurasia into a single, interconnected web. It had demonstrated that the world was far larger and more diverse than anyone had previously imagined. The knowledge that flowed west during this period, the stories of Marco Polo and others, helped to fuel the curiosity and ambition of the European Renaissance. The desire to find a new sea route to the riches of the East, to bypass the old Silk Road now controlled by hostile powers, would directly lead to the Age of Discovery. In a very real sense, the voyages of Christopher Columbus were an answer to the challenge posed by the legacy of Genghis Khan. The world forged by the people of the eternal blue sky was a world of paradoxes. It was a world shrunk by the speed of the Mongol horse and the safety of the yam, yet vast in its diversity. It was a world of breathtaking cruelty and equally breathtaking beauty. It was an empire born on the empty steppe that came to encompass half of humanity. It was a story of a single family that rose to conquer the world, only to find that the world was too large, too complex, and too stubborn to be held forever in a single grasp. It was a brief, violent, and brilliant flash that illuminated the entire globe, and when it faded, the world it left behind was one that could never be the same again. Looking back upon this epoch, it is easy to be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the events, by the numbers of the dead, by the size of the armies, and the extent of the empires. But to truly understand the Mongol phenomenon, we must also look at the smaller, more intimate details of their culture. The world view, that propelled them from obscurity to world domination. At the core of their belief system was the relationship between the individual, the tribe, and the sky. The sky for the Mongols was not an empty void. It was a living, conscious entity, Tengri, the eternal blue sky. Tengri was the supreme deity, the source of all power and legitimacy. A leader, a Khan, did not rule by right of birth alone. He ruled because he possessed Kutug, a divine mandate granted to him by Tengri. Genghis Khan's incredible success was seen as irrefutable proof that he was the chosen instrument of heaven's will. This belief gave the Mongols a powerful sense of destiny, a conviction that their conquests were not merely acts of plunder, but the fulfillment of a divine mission to bring all the peoples of the world under the dominion of a single, heaven-sent ruler. This divine mandate was paired with a deep reverence for the earth, known as a tugen. The land was sacred, not something to be owned, divided, or permanently altered. This is why the Mongols had so little interest in agriculture, and why they viewed the walled, permanent cities of sedentary peoples with such inherent suspicion. To plough the earth was, in a sense, to scar it. To build a stone city was to imprison oneself. Their ideal was to live in harmony with the natural world, to move with the seasons, to leave as little a trace as possible upon the sacred earth. This nomadic ethos stood in stark contrast to the civilizations they conquered, creating a fundamental and often irreconcilable cultural divide. Loyalty was the supreme virtue in this society. In a world with few physical structures for protection, a person's only true security lay in their network of relationships. Betrayal of one's sworn lord or blood brother was the most heinous of crimes, punishable by death. Genghis Khan's own rise was built upon this principle. He rewarded loyalty with unwavering generosity and punished betrayal with utter ruthlessness. The army he built was not just a collection of warriors, it was a pyramid of personal loyalties, with every man bound by oath to his commander, and all commanders bound by oath to the Khan. This created a level of discipline and cohesion that other, more fractious feudal armies simply could not match. The Mongol army was organised on a decimal system, a simple but revolutionary innovation. All able-bodied men were organised into units of 10, Arban, 100, Zuun, 1,000, Mingan, and 10,000, Tumen. The leader of each unit was responsible for the men under his command. If one man from an Arban deserted in battle, the other 9 were executed. This system fostered an intense sense of collective responsibility and small unit cohesion. It also allowed for incredible tactical flexibility. A commander could detach and maneuver units with precision, like pieces on a chessboard, allowing for the complex tactics of envelopment and feigned retreat that so often bewildered their enemies. Their primary weapon was the Mongol composite bow. This was a technological marvel, a masterpiece of engineering made from laminated horn, wood, and sinew. It was relatively short, making it easy to wield from horseback, but immensely powerful, capable of shooting arrows with armour-piercing tips over distances of several hundred metres. A Mongol warrior could fire a stream of arrows with speed and accuracy, while galloping at full speed, a skill that required a lifetime of practice. Their enemies, often heavily armoured infantry or knights, were frequently decimated by a storm of arrows long before they could even get close enough to engage in hand-to-hand combat. The horse was the other half of this devastating equation. The Mongol horse was not a large, powerful warhorse like a European destrier. It was a small, hardy, and incredibly resilient breed, capable of surviving on sparse vegetation and enduring extreme temperatures. Each warrior would have a string of several horses, allowing him to switch mounts during a long march, or even in the heat of battle, giving the Mongol armies a capacity for speed and endurance that was simply unmatched. They could cover 100 miles in a single day, appearing as if from nowhere to strike at an unsuspecting enemy. The Mongol army did not have supply trains in the traditional sense. The army itself was its own supply train, living off the land and drinking the milk and sometimes the blood of their horses. Life within the Mongol camp was governed by a strict, almost Spartan discipline. The spoils of war were not a free-for-all. All loot was collected and then distributed, systematically by the Khan, with shares going to warriors, widows and orphans. This ensured that the army was provided for and prevented the kind of chaotic plundering that could break the discipline of other armies. This system, like the decimal organisation, was another key component of the Yasa, the law code that provided the institutional backbone for their conquests. The role of women in Mongol society was also notably different from that of their counterparts in the sedentary civilizations they conquered. While it was a patriarchal society, Mongol women enjoyed a degree of authority and freedom that often shocked foreign observers. Because the men were so often away on hunts or military campaigns, women were responsible for the management of the camp, the herds, and the household economy. They could own property, and their advice was often sought in political matters. The powerful influence of women like Genghis Khan's wife Berta, or his mother Hoelun, and the political acumen of regents like Turgen and Sorgakhtani demonstrate that women were not merely passive figures, but active and influential players in the shaping of the empire. When we consider all these cultural and technological factors, the unifying ideology of Tengri, the harsh pragmatism of the Yasa, the revolutionary organisation of the army, the power of the composite bow, the endurance of the horse, and the relative autonomy of its women, the Mongol explosion begins to seem less like a historical anomaly and more like a perfect storm. It was the culmination of centuries of steppe life, a culture and a way of war perfectly adapted to its environment, which was then organised and unleashed upon the wider world by the singular genius of one man. The decline of the Mongol Empire can also be seen through this cultural lens. The very success of the conquest created a crisis of identity. As the Khans and their retinue settled into the opulent courts of Persia and China, the old nomadic virtues began to erode. The hardy, disciplined warrior of the steppe was replaced by the court politician, the pampered prince. The internal conflicts that tore the Khanates apart were often framed as a struggle between the traditionalists who wanted to adhere to the Yasa and the nomadic lifestyle, and the progressives who wished to embrace the sedentary urban cultures of the lands they now ruled. The conversion to the great universalist religions like Islam and Buddhism also played a part. While these conversions helped to legitimize their rule, they also chipped away at the unique ideological foundation of the empire. A Mongol Khan, who was also a devout Muslim or Buddhist, was, in a sense, no longer just a Mongol Khan. His loyalties were now divided, his worldview altered. The unifying force of the belief in Tengri's exclusive mandate for the House of Genghis Khan was diluted and eventually lost. Furthermore, the Mongols were always a tiny demographic minority in the lands they ruled. In China, they were perhaps 1% of the population. In Persia, even less. Their rule depended on their military supremacy and their ability to co-opt the local elites. As their military prowess waned and their internal divisions grew, they became vulnerable. They could be assimilated, or they could be overthrown. In China, they were overthrown. In Persia and Russia, they were largely assimilated, blending into the Turkic populations that would succeed them. The conquerors were, in the end, conquered by the cultures of their subjects. Today, the physical remnants of the Mongol Empire are surprisingly scarce. Karakoram, the great capital, is now a field of ruins marked only by a later Buddhist monastery. Sarai, the glittering capital of the Golden Horde, has vanished almost without a trace, its mud brick walls dissolved back into the steppe from which they came. The Mongols were not great builders in stone. Their true monuments were not cities or temples, but the connections they forged and the destructions they wrought. Their legacy is written not on buildings, but into the DNA of the nations that emerged from their empire, in the pathways of trade and conflict they established, and in the collective memory of the world they so violently and completely remade. To walk through the Forbidden City in Beijing today is to walk through a palace built on the foundations of Kublai Khan's Dadu. To wander the streets of Samarkand is to witness the vision of Timur, the inheritor of the Mongol legacy. To trace the political origins of modern Russia is to find them in the struggle to throw off the Mongol yoke. The story of the Mongol Empire is not a self-contained episode from a distant past. It is a foundational event of the modern world, a great and terrible engine that pushed history onto a new and unforeseen track. The story of the Mongol conquests is also a profound meditation on the nature of power itself. It demonstrates how a people on the margins, dismissed as barbarians, can rise to topple the established centres of civilization. It shows how technology, organisation, and a powerful ideology can overcome sheer numbers. But it also serves as a cautionary tale about the transience of that power. The empire created in a single generation by force of arms could not be sustained for more than a few generations. The very size and diversity that were a testament to its strength also contained the seeds of its inevitable dissolution. In the final analysis, the Mongols held up a mirror to the world of the 13th century, and the reflection was often a brutal one. They exposed the weaknesses, the divisions, and the arrogance of the great sedentary empires. They were a force of creative destruction, a historical catalyst that broke down old structures and, in doing so, cleared the ground for new ones to grow. They were the storm that swept away the old world, and in its thunder one could hear the first faint whispers of the new. The horsemen, from the land of the eternal blue sky, rode onto the world stage, and for a century they commanded it completely, leaving behind a silence filled with echoes that resound to this day. One of the most enduring of these echoes is the very name of their founder. Genghis Khan remains one of the most recognised and yet most controversial figures in all of history. In the lands that suffered from his conquests, in Iran, Russia, and much of Eastern Europe, his name is still synonymous with barbarity and destruction. He is remembered as a ruthless tyrant, a butcher of millions. This view is not without merit. The sheer scale of the death and devastation his armies unleashed is undeniable, and stands as a dark testament to the human cost of empire building. But in his homeland of Mongolia, his legacy is viewed in a completely different light. There, Genghis Khan, or Chinggis Khan, as he is properly known, is not a conqueror, but a creator. He is the founding father of the nation, the great unifier who took the warring, scattered tribes of the steppe and forged them into a single people with a shared identity and a common purpose. He is a lawgiver, a military genius, and a national hero. His image is everywhere, on the currency, on statues, on the brands of vodka and cigarettes. To Mongolians, he represents the pinnacle of their history, a time when their nations stood at the very centre of the world. This duality is central to understanding the Mongol phenomenon. It was simultaneously an act of nation-building and an act of world-breaking. The same policies that unified the Mongols, the dismantling of old tribal loyalties, the creation of a meritocratic army, the absolute demand for obedience, were the very instruments that made the conquest of other nations possible. The internal peace of Mongolia was purchased at the price of external war on a colossal scale. The religious tolerance practiced by the Mongols is another area of this complex legacy. The great Khans were, for the most part, pragmatists. They understood that their empire encompassed a bewildering variety of faiths. To try and impose their own shamanistic beliefs on their Christian, Muslim, and Buddhist subjects would have been a recipe for endless rebellion. So, they adopted a policy of toleration, exempting the clergy of recognised religions from taxation, and allowing them to pray for the well-being of the Khan in their own manner. This was not tolerance born of a modern liberal belief in freedom of conscience. It was a practical tool of imperial governance. It was also rooted in the Mongol belief that all peaceful religions that acknowledged a single high god were, in their own way, worshipping the same Tengri. As Munka Khan famously told the Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, just as God gave different fingers to the hand, so has he given different ways to men. This pragmatic pluralism made the Mongol Empire a surprising refuge for some religious minorities who were persecuted in their own lands, while simultaneously horrifying the members of more doctrinaire faiths who saw it as a sign of spiritual indifference. The economic impact of the empire was just as profound. By creating a single economic space that stretched across Eurasia, the Mongols effectively created the First World System. The flow of capital, goods, and technology was no longer regional, it was continental. The Yuan dynasty's use of paper money, backed by the authority of the state, was a sophisticated economic concept that astonished travellers like Marco Polo. While it ultimately succumbed to hyperinflation, it was a forerunner of modern fiat currency systems. They also inadvertently shifted the economic balance of power in the world. The destruction of the economic heartlands of the Islamic world in Persia and Central Asia was a blow from which the region took centuries to recover. Conversely, the Mongols' reliance on and patronage of Italian maritime republics like Genoa and Venice for trade in the Black Sea and the Mediterranean enriched these cities immensely, arguably helping to fuel the economic boom that would underpin the Italian Renaissance. The Mongol effect was like tilting a great table. Wealth and power flowed away from some areas and pooled in others. The military legacy is perhaps the most obvious. The Mongol way of war, emphasizing speed, mobility, coordination, and psychological terror, set a new standard for military effectiveness. European armies that faced them were forced to adapt or be destroyed. The concept of a unified command structure, disciplined maneuvers, and sophisticated intelligence gathering became more widespread. In the east, the Ming dynasty, which overthrew the Mongols, built the Great Wall not as a static defence, but as a complex system for channeling and containing the threat of a potential nomadic resurgence, a direct architectural response to the trauma of the Mongol conquest. Yet, for all the global impact, the most intimate and lasting story of the Mongols is their relationship with the steppe itself. The grasslands were their cradle and their fortress. It was the source of their strength, the landscape that shaped their worldview and their way of life. When their imperial adventure in the sedentary world came to an end, it was to the steppe that they returned. The empire was a brilliant, fiery and relatively brief aberration in a much longer story of nomadic pastoralism. The retreat of the Yuan back to Mongolia after 1368 was not an ending, but a reversion to a historical mean. Once again, the steppe became a world apart, a land of feuding tribes and charismatic khans. The descendants of Genghis Khan continued to rule in Mongolia for centuries, but their power was local, not global. They were once again a people on the periphery, their moment at the centre of the world having passed. The silence that fell over the high grasslands of Asia was the silence of a dream that had ended. This dream, however, had been so potent that it would inspire imitation for centuries. The memory of the Pax Mongolica became a golden age for later rulers, from the Timurids in Persia to the Mughals in India to the Manchus who would later conquer China and found the Qing dynasty. The model of a unified, disciplined, multi-ethnic empire built by nomadic conquerors remained a powerful political ideal. The ghost of Genghis Khan rode with the armies of countless future emperors who sought to emulate his astonishing success. The final dissolution of the Mongol identity as a world force was a slow and complex process. In the West, the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate were absorbed into the broader Turco-Islamic world. Their descendants became the Uzbeks, the Tatars, the Kazakhs, new ethnic groups forged in the crucible of the Mongol conquests. In the East, the Mongols themselves came under the increasing influence of Tibetan Buddhism in the 16th and 17th centuries, a conversion which profoundly reshaped their culture, turning a fiercely martial people towards a more pacific, monastic way of life. Eventually, the last vestiges of their independence were extinguished by the rise of two massive sedentary empires that had learned the lessons of the past. To the south, the Manchu Qing dynasty of China incorporated Inner Mongolia into its empire and made Outer Mongolia a protectorate. To the west, the Russian Empire expanded relentlessly across Siberia and the steppes, absorbing the lands of the former Golden Horde and pushing up against the frontiers of the Chinese sphere of influence. The Mongol homeland, once the terrifying centre of the world, was now a quiet backwater, squeezed between two colossal neighbours. The age of the nomadic empire was well and truly over. The future belonged to the settled empires with their vast infantry armies, their cannons, and their sprawling bureaucracies. The story that began with a boy named Temujin, clutching a clot of blood in a felt tent, had come full circle. The power that had exploded out of the steppe to consume the world had, over centuries, receded back into it. The world that the Mongols had forged with the horse and the bow was now a world ruled by the farm and the firearm. It is a stark reminder that no single way of life, no matter how perfectly adapted or brilliantly led, can dominate the world forever. History is a relentless tide, and the high water mark of the Mongol Empire, though perhaps the highest ever reached by a single conquest, was destined, like all tides, to recede. To truly grasp the force that was the Mongol army, we must look beyond the throne of the great Khan and into the mind of his greatest instrument. We must look to a man named Subutai. He was not of the royal bloodline, but was instead the son of a common blacksmith. He joined Temujin as a teenager, offering his service, and would become the chief architect of the most audacious military campaigns in human history. He was the indispensable general, the one who turned the Khan's strategic vision into terrifying reality on the battlefield. Subutai was a true master of the art of war. He was a patient and meticulous planner, a general who believed that battles were won long before the first arrow was fired. He was a pioneer of military intelligence, always sending out vast screens of scouts, sometimes hundreds of miles ahead of his main force. These scouts would map the terrain, identify enemy strengths and weaknesses, locate grazing lands and water sources, and spread terror and disinformation among the local population. By the time Subutai's main army arrived, he often knew more about his enemy's land than they did themselves. His career spanned the entire era of the Great Conquests. He was at Genghis Khan's side during the unification of the steppe and the grueling war against the Jin in China. He helped command the devastating invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire. Along with the dashing General Jebe, he led the legendary Great Raid around the Caspian Sea, an epic of reconnaissance that covered over 5,000 miles and defeated a dozen armies. He was a man who had campaigned from the frozen rivers of Siberia to the hot plains of Persia, a general who had seen more of the world than perhaps any other man of his time. But his final campaign, the invasion of Europe, was his masterpiece. By this time, in the late 1230s, Subutai was an old man, overweight and no longer able to ride a horse with ease. He travelled in a cart from which he directed the movements of his 100,000 men. But his mind was as sharp as ever. The European knights he faced were brave and heavily armoured, but they fought as individuals seeking personal glory. They were no match for Subutai's coordinated, multi-pronged assaults that operated across a front 500 miles wide. He did not just defeat armies, he annihilated them, systematically erasing any potential for future resistance. The campaign was a textbook example of Mongol strategy. It began in the depths of winter, a season when European armies traditionally did not fight. The Mongols used the frozen rivers of Russia as highways, sweeping down upon the unsuspecting Russia's principalities with breathtaking speed. When they reached the plains of Hungary, Subutai deliberately divided his forces, a move that his opponents mistook for weakness. It was, in fact, an elaborate trap. While one Mongol column drew the main Hungarian army into a battle at Mohi, other columns were circling around, securing bridges and cutting off any avenue of escape. The result was not a battle, but a slaughter. Subutai was not just a conqueror, he was a grandmaster of a deadly continent-spanning game of chess. This level of strategic sophistication was not the product of a single mind, but of an entire military system. The Mongol army was, in essence, a learning machine. After every campaign, a debriefing or Kurultai was held where generals would analyse their successes and failures. Information about new technologies, like the siege weapons of the Chinese or the plate armour of the Europeans, was systematically gathered, studied, and incorporated into their own tactics. Captured engineers and artisans were not just put to work, they were interrogated, their knowledge squeezed out and added to the ever-growing Mongol repository of military science. They were, in effect, the world's first professional general staff. Psychological warfare was a key and deliberately cultivated pillar of this system. Before an invasion, rumours and terrifying stories would be intentionally spread by merchants and spies, meant to paralyse the will of their intended victims. The Mongols understood that fear was a far more efficient weapon than the sword. It could make cities surrender without a fight and cause armies to break and run before they were even engaged. The infamous pyramids of skulls were not acts of random, mindless savagery. They were calculated acts of political theatre, a gruesome message sent to the next city down the road, a message that was universally understood. Resist, and this will be your fate. To see this machine in action from the perspective of its victims is to understand the true meaning of historical shock. Let us turn our gaze to the world of the Kievan Rus in the early 13th century. It was a land of deep forests and slow-moving rivers, a loose confederation of feuding principalities centred around cities like Kiev, Novgorod, and Vladimir. Their world was defined by the rhythm of the seasons, by the politics of their princely rivalries, and by their deep Orthodox Christian faith inherited from Byzantium. Their enemies were familiar, rival princes or nomadic raiders from the southern steppes like the Cumans. They were a people who believed their world, for all its troubles, was a known and understandable place. The first appearance of the Mongols during the raid of Jibi and Subutai in 1223 was a bewildering shock. A Russian and Cuman coalition army met this unknown enemy at the Kalka River. The Mongols feigned a retreat for over a week, luring the overconfident princes deep into the steppe, stretching their supply lines and exhausting their troops. Then they turned and unleashed a devastating attack that annihilated the allied army. After this stunning victory, the Mongols simply vanished, disappearing back into the east as mysteriously as they had come. For over a decade, they were spoken of like a biblical plague, a divine punishment that had come and gone. The Rus princes learned nothing from the disaster and soon went back to their internecine squabbles. When the full invasion came in the winter of 1237, it was a cataclysm beyond their comprehension. The city of Ryazan was the first to be struck. When its princes refused to surrender, the city was besieged, and after a few days of relentless assault, utterly destroyed. The entire population, including the ruling family, was put to the sword. A chronicler wrote that in the city there was no eye to weep for the dead. The news of this utter annihilation sent a wave of panic across the Rus lands. This was not a familiar raid for plunder. This was a storm that consumed everything in its path. One by one, the cities of the Rus fell. Moscow, at that time a minor wooden fort, was burned to the ground. The grand city of Vladimir, the political centre of the northeast, was captured, and its magnificent cathedral, where the grand princely family had taken refuge, was set alight, burning everyone inside. The final blow came in 1240 with the siege of Kiev. For centuries, Kiev had been the spiritual heart of the Rus, a city of golden dome churches and monasteries known for its beauty and wealth. The Mongol army that surrounded it was so vast, it was said, that the citizens could not hear each other speak for the sound of the creaking carts, the neighing of horses, and the shouting of the soldiers. The siege was short and brutal. The city's stone walls, formidable by local standards, were no match for the Chinese catapults of the Mongol army. Once the walls were breached, the battle moved into the streets, a desperate, hopeless struggle. The last defenders made their stand in the great Church of the Tithes, the oldest stone church in the Rus, but the weight of the people crowded onto its roof caused it to collapse, burying them in the ruins. Kiev was so thoroughly sacked and its people so completely massacred that when the papal envoy John of Plano Carpini passed through it 6 years later, he noted that it consisted of fewer than 200 houses and that the ground was still littered with human skulls and bones. The Mongol conquest was the single greatest catastrophe in the history of the Kievan Rus. It was a demographic, economic and cultural disaster that shattered their world. The old southern centres of power were left in ruins, and the population shifted north into the more remote and defensible forest zones. But it was not an ending. It was a violent and traumatic beginning to a new chapter, one that would be defined by 2.5 centuries of Mongol overlordship. Life under the so-called Mongol yoke was a complex reality of submission, adaptation, and survival. The primary demand of the Golden Horde was tribute. Mongol census takers, often aided by Chinese administrators, meticulously recorded the population and its productive capacity to assess a brutally efficient tax, the vikord. This tribute, collected in silver, furs, and other valuable goods, was a constant drain on the Russian economy, funneling its wealth eastward to the great Mongol capital at Sarai. The political life of the Rus' princes was completely reoriented. Their feuds did not cease, but now they were fought not just on the battlefield, but in the halls of the Khan's court. A prince's survival and success depended on his ability to curry favour with his Mongol masters. They made the long, arduous journey to Sarai, bearing lavish gifts, to prostrate themselves before the Khan and secure the Yarlik that confirmed their right to rule. It was a deeply humiliating process, but it was the only political game in town. The prince who could best navigate these treacherous waters, who could prove himself the most loyal and effective servant of the Horde, would triumph over his rivals. It was in this environment that the hitherto obscure Principality of Moscow began its slow, methodical rise. The Muscovite princes proved to be masters of this new political reality. They were pragmatic, ruthless, and patient. They positioned themselves as the most reliable vassals of the horde, securing for themselves the lucrative and powerful position of chief tribute collector for all the Rus' lands. This allowed them to accumulate vast wealth and to use the authority of the Mongols to subordinate other, more rebellious principalities to their will. They were, in a sense, using the power of the yoke to forge the tools of their own future dominance. The Mongol influence seeped into the very fabric of Russian life. The Russian military adopted Mongol tactics, weapons, and organizational principles. The Russian state bureaucracy, with its systems of census, taxation, and courier services, YAM, was heavily modelled on Mongol administrative practices. Even the Russian language absorbed hundreds of Turkic and Mongol words related to commerce, government, and military affairs. The autocratic power of the later Muscovite grand princes, and eventually the Tsars, which was so absolute and so different from the more consensual politics of other European monarchies, was in many ways a direct inheritance from the Mongol concept of the all-powerful Khan. The Russian state that would emerge from under the yoke was one that had been permanently hardened and reshaped by the experience. Far away to the east, in the opulent world of Yuan China, a very different kind of cultural negotiation was taking place. Kublai Khan's capital at Dadu was not a remote tent city like Sarai. It was the glittering heart of a vast and ancient civilization, and it was deliberately designed to impress. The city was a perfect grid, a testament to Chinese cosmological principles, but its inhabitants and its culture were a vibrant, chaotic mix of the entire Mongol world. To walk the streets of Dadu in the late 13th century would have been an experience of astonishing diversity. You would have seen Mongol warriors in their traditional robes and furs, rubbing shoulders with Confucian scholars in their silk gowns. You would have heard the chatter of dozens of languages: Turkic, Persian, Arabic, and the various dialects of Chinese, as well as the guttural sound of Mongolian. You would have seen Nestorian Christian churches with their crosses, Muslim mosques with their minarets, and Tibetan Buddhist lamas in their saffron robes, all operating freely under the Khan's protection. The court of the Great Khan was the centre of this multicultural universe. Kublai, though he adopted many of the trappings of a Chinese emperor, never fully abandoned his Mongol roots. He hosted enormous, boisterous feasts in the Mongol style, where nobles would drink vast quantities of fermented mare's milk, kumis, from golden cups. He maintained a huge imperial hunting guard, and would embark on grand hunts with thousands of falconers and beaters, a mobile tented city moving across the plains north of his capital, a recreation of the nomadic life he had left behind. It was into this world that Marco Polo claimed to have arrived. Whether one believes all the details of his account, the picture he paints is one of a highly organised and immensely wealthy state, run by a surprisingly cosmopolitan bureaucracy. He describes the Semu Ren, the foreign administrators from the West who held a privileged position. These men, Persians, Arabs, Uyghurs, and even a few Europeans, were the trusted middle managers of the empire. They were literate, numerate, and, most importantly, they had no local power base or family ties within China, meaning their loyalty was solely to the Khan. They ran the powerful finance ministries and the state monopolies on salt and iron, becoming a crucial, if much resented, cog in the machinery of Yuan rule. This international character spurred a unique cultural fusion. In the decorative arts, Chinese motifs like the dragon and the phoenix found their way into the intricate designs of Persian pottery and miniature painting, carried west by artisans working in the Ilkhanate. Conversely, the influence of Persian art, particularly its use of cobalt blue for underglazed ceramics, led to the creation of the iconic blue and white porcelain that would become one of China's most famous and sought-after exports for centuries to come. The Mongol Empire acted like a giant cultural blender, mixing and matching artistic traditions from opposite ends of the continent. Science and technology also flowed freely along the arteries of the empire. Kublai Khan, a man of immense intellectual curiosity, established an Islamic observatory in Dadu, staffed by Persian astronomers. Their task was to work alongside their Chinese counterparts, sharing knowledge and creating a more accurate calendar for the empire. The advanced astronomical tables and instruments from the Great Observatory at Maragay in Persia were brought to China, while Chinese discoveries in medicine and pharmacology were translated into Persian and Arabic. It was a moment of true scientific collaboration on a continental scale, all under the patronage of a Mongol ruler. The theatre and literature of the Yuan period also reflected this unique social environment. With the traditional Confucian scholar elite largely excluded from the highest levels of government, many talented writers turned their attention to popular entertainment, leading to a golden age of Chinese opera and drama. These plays, written in the vernacular language rather than classical Chinese, often contained subtle and not-so-subtle critiques of the Mongol rulers, expressing the frustrations and resentments of the conquered Chinese populace through historical allegories and dramatic tales. It was a form of cultural resistance, a way of preserving Chinese identity in a world turned upside down. Yet, for all this vibrant cultural exchange and economic activity, the foundation of Yuan rule remained fragile. The Mongols and their foreign allies were a tiny ruling class floating atop a vast and ancient Chinese society. They never truly integrated. They passed laws forbidding the Chinese from owning weapons, learning the Mongol language, or intermarrying with their conquerors. This legal and social segregation ensured that they would always be seen as illegitimate foreign occupiers. The peace of the Mongol peace in China was the peace of a garrison, not the peace of a truly unified society. This fundamental disconnect was mirrored in the other Khanates. The Ilkhans of Persia only secured their rule after converting to Islam, effectively surrendering their unique Mongol identity to the culture of their subjects. In the Golden Horde, the Mongol elite gradually merged with the Turkic Kipchak population, becoming a new Islamized steppe culture that had less and less in common with its cousins in the east. The dream of a single, world-spanning Mongol nation, united by the blood of Genghis Khan and the laws of the Yasa, was dissolving in the powerful cultural currents of the civilizations it had conquered. The unravelling of the empire was also accelerated by forces that even the Mongols could not control. The period of their decline coincided with the beginning of the Little Ice Age, a global climatic shift that brought colder temperatures and more erratic weather. For the agricultural societies of China and Persia, this meant more frequent crop failures, famines, and floods. For the nomadic economies of the Golden Horde and the Chagatai Khanate, it meant a loss of grazing land and a reduction in the size of their vital herds. This environmental stress exacerbated the existing political and social tensions, creating a powder keg of popular discontent. And then came the plague. The Black Death was not a mere historical event, it was a biological apocalypse. It moved along the very trade routes the Mongols had made safe, turning the arteries of their empire into vectors of death. It swept through China in the 1330s, through the Golden Horde in the 1340s, and into the Middle East and Europe shortly after. The demographic collapse was staggering, with some regions losing between a third and a half of their population. The plague shattered the foundations of the Mongol world order. It crippled the economy, disrupting trade and agriculture. It fatally weakened the Mongol armies, which were just as susceptible to the disease as anyone else, and it shattered their ideological legitimacy. In China, the plague and the accompanying natural disasters were seen as definitive proof that the UN had lost the mandate of heaven. In the Islamic world, the pandemic was often interpreted as a divine punishment. The Pax Mongolica, the great achievement that had defined the 13th century, had now, in the 14th, become a curse, an interconnected highway for a global pandemic that brought the whole system crashing down. The final decades of the Mongol rule in China, Persia, and Russia were not a story of a single, dramatic collapse, but of a slow, grinding disintegration. The central authority of the Khans weakened, and local warlords, both Mongol and native, rose to carve out their own domains. The great unified political spaces created by the conquest fractured back into their constituent geographical parts. The empire did not fall, it crumbled. What rose from the ashes was a world that had been irrevocably changed. The Ming dynasty in China, the Timurid Empire in Persia, the Grand Duchy of Moscow in Russia, and the Ottoman Empire in Anatolia were the primary successor states. All of them were, in their own way, a response to the Mongol legacy. The Ming built the Great Wall to keep the steppe out. The Muscovites built a centralized autocratic state to dominate their neighbors, and ensure they would never again be subjugated. The Ottomans and Timurids competed to claim the mantle of the next great world-conquering empire. The memory of the Mongols, both as a model to be emulated and as a threat to be contained, was a driving force in the politics of the post-Mongol world. This complex legacy challenges us to think about history in a different way. It forces us to move beyond simple narratives of good versus evil or civilization versus barbarism. The Mongols were both destroyers and connectors, both tyrants and unifiers. Their story is a powerful testament to the fact that history is often driven by those on the margins, and that periods of intense violence and disruption can also, paradoxically, be periods of intense exchange and transformation. They were a force of nature that swept across the globe, and like a great flood, they receded to reveal a landscape that was both devastated and fertilized, a world changed forever by their passing. Let us return for a moment to the source of this incredible historical force, to the Mongolian steppe itself. The landscape that gave birth to the conquerors is, in many ways, the key to understanding them. It is a world of immense scale and profound emptiness, a land that fosters a unique sense of perspective. Under the vast, overarching dome of the sky, human concerns can seem small and transient. What matters is resilience, mobility, and an unsentimental understanding of the cycles of life and death, of summer and winter, of plenty and of want. This was the environment that shaped the Mongol character. They were, above all, pragmatists. Their shamanistic religion was not a creed of elaborate theology and rigid dogma, but a practical framework for navigating the forces of the natural world. They revered the power of the sky, the spirit of the mountains, and the life-giving force of the rivers. Their morality was based on a simple, powerful code, the yasa, which was less concerned with abstract concepts of sin and salvation, and more with the practical requirements for holding a fragile nomadic society together. This pragmatism extended to their approach to empire. When they encountered a new technology that worked, they adopted it. When they met a skilled artisan or a clever administrator, they employed him, regardless of his race or religion. They were not interested in converting their subjects or imposing their own culture upon them. They were interested in what worked, what would allow them to control vast territories, extract wealth efficiently, and maintain order. This ruthless, unsentimental pragmatism was one of their greatest strengths, allowing them to adapt and innovate with a speed that left their more tradition-bound rivals in the dust. Consider their approach to law and order. Within the boundaries of their empire, the Mongols enforced a peace that was absolute and brutal. The punishment for theft, especially of a horse, was often death. Banditry on the caravan routes was suppressed with extreme prejudice. This created a level of security for travellers and merchants that was unprecedented. The goal was not justice in a moral sense, but order in a practical sense. A safe and predictable empire was a profitable empire, one through which tribute and trade could flow without interruption. Their census-taking is another example of this pragmatic genius. To tax an empire, you must first know what is in it. The Mongols conducted detailed censuses of population and wealth across their entire domain, from China to Russia. These were massive undertakings requiring a sophisticated bureaucracy of scribes and administrators. The data they collected allowed them to assess taxes and levy troops with a level of efficiency that was unheard of. They were in this sense pioneers of statecraft, applying a systematic, data-driven approach to the business of ruling. But this very pragmatism also contained a deep inherent contradiction. The Mongol way of life, their nomadic pastoralism, was fundamentally at odds with the needs of the vast sedentary agricultural empires they had conquered. A tax-paying peasant farmer is the foundation of a state like China or Persia. But from a Mongol perspective, a farmer was a strange and somewhat contemptible figure, a man tied to a single plot of land, unable to move, a creature of the earth rather than the sky. This cultural disdain for agriculture led to some of the most destructive acts of their early conquests. There were debates at the court of Ogedei Khan where some traditionalist Mongol nobles argued that all of northern China should be depopulated of its farmers and turned back into pasture land for Mongol horses. They were only dissuaded by the wise counsel of Yelu Chukai, who patiently explained that a living, tax-paying peasantry would generate far more revenue in the long run than an empty field. It was an argument made on the grounds of pure pragmatism, the only kind the Mongol leaders would truly understand. Over time, this fundamental tension between the nomadic and the sedentary ways of life played out across the empire. The rulers of the Yuan and the Ilkhanate were constantly trying to balance the needs of their agricultural subjects with the demands and cultural instincts of their Mongol warrior elite. They established hunting reserves near their capitals, maintained vast imperial herds, and continued to practice nomadic rituals, all in an attempt to preserve their Mongol identity in the midst of a sea of sedentary culture. But it was a losing battle. The sheer demographic and cultural gravity of China and Persia was too powerful. The conquerors were slowly being tamed by the conquered. This process of cultural change is perhaps best illustrated by the evolution of the Mongol diet. The traditional steppe diet was incredibly simple, consisting almost entirely of meat and dairy products, mutton, yogurt, cheese, and kumis. Vegetables and grains were almost entirely absent. As the Mongol elite settled into their new capitals, their tastes began to change. They were introduced to the sophisticated cuisines of China and Persia, with their complex spices, their rice and noodles, their fruits and vegetables. The imperial kitchens of Kublai Khan became famous for their lavish banquets, where traditional Mongol roasted meats were served alongside elaborate Chinese dishes. The diet of the rulers was becoming as cosmopolitan as their empire. Even their way of dressing changed. The simple, practical robes of leather and felt, designed for a life on horseback, were gradually replaced, at least at court, by the luxurious silks and brocades of their subjects. The Khan, while still a Mongol warrior at heart, also had to look the part of a Chinese emperor or a Persian sultan. This visual transformation was a powerful symbol of the deeper cultural shifts that were taking place. The empire was changing the Mongols just as surely as the Mongols were changing the world. The ultimate failure of the Mongols to create a lasting, unified empire can be traced back to this central, unresolved contradiction. They were a people of the steppe who had conquered the Sone. They had created a world system based on mobility and connection, but they themselves were unable to find a stable, long-term synthesis between their own nomadic identity and the sedentary civilizations they ruled. Their empire was a brilliant temporary bridge between two different modes of human existence, and like all bridges, it was destined to connect two shores, not to become a permanent dwelling place in itself. When the bridge collapsed, the connections were not entirely severed. The memory of that brief, violent unity lingered. The knowledge that the world was a single, interconnected space, that one could travel from the Mediterranean to the Pacific under the protection of a single power, was a profound revelation. It permanently expanded the mental horizons of the peoples of Eurasia. The age of isolated civilizations was over. The Mongol conquest had, by shattering the old world, created the first draft of a new, globalized one. The tales of the wealth of the East, brought back by merchants and missionaries who had travelled under the Mongol peace, ignited a fire in the European imagination. The desire to gain direct access to the spices of India and the silks of China, to bypass the Muslim and Venetian middlemen who controlled the old routes, became a powerful economic and political driver. This quest for a new path to the Orient was what launched the great European voyages of discovery in the late 15th century. When Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached India, and when Christopher Columbus, believing he had reached the East Indies, landed in the Americas, they were sailing in the wake of the Mongols. They were seeking to reconnect with the world that the Pax Mongolica had briefly opened up. The global age that was inaugurated by these voyages, an age of European maritime empires, was in many ways a direct, if unintended, consequence of the earlier land-based empire of the steppe nomads. The horsemen had in the end passed the torch to the sailors, and so the story of the Mongol Empire is not just a story of the 13th century. It is a story that casts a long shadow over the centuries that followed, a story whose echoes can still be heard in the geopolitics, the cultures, and the connections of our world today. It serves as a powerful reminder that history is not a linear progression, but a complex tapestry woven with threads of violence and creation, of destruction and exchange. and that sometimes the most profound and lasting changes come not from the centres of established power, but from the vast, empty spaces on the edge of the map. To understand the sheer strangeness of this period, it helps to focus on the individuals caught within its currents. Imagine a Genoese merchant in the 1340s, living in the bustling port of Tarna on the Sea of Azov, a city under the rule of the Golden Horde. His world is one of contracts and caravans, of calculating profits on silk bought from a Sogdian trader, which was produced in China and destined for the looms of Florence. He speaks a pidgin of Italian, Greek and Kipchak Turkic. He's a Christian, but his business partner might be a Muslim Tatar, and the local governor who resolves their disputes is a Mongol official who follows the laws of the Yasa. This merchant's world is thoroughly interconnected. He is aware of the political situation in the Ilkhanate because it affects the price of spices. He follows news of the Yuan court because the stability of their paper currency impacts his own bottom line. He has seen technologies like the abacus for calculation or the compass for navigation that have trickled in from the East. His worldview is fundamentally commercial and cosmopolitan. He is a product of the Pax Mongolica, a man whose very existence would have been impossible a century earlier. Now imagine a Tibetan Buddhist monk, a member of the Sakya school, summoned to the court of Kublai Khan. In his homeland, his monastery is a centre of spiritual power, but also of intense political manoeuvring. Under the Mongols, his sect has been granted a special status, given authority over all of Tibet in exchange for acting as spiritual advisors to the Great Khan. Our monk travels the long road to Dadu, a journey of many months through rugged mountains and high plateaus. At the imperial court, he finds himself in a world of bewildering complexity. He must navigate the intricate protocols of the court, competing for the Khan's favour with Nestorian Christians, Taoist masters, and Confucian scholars. He participates in formal religious debates, presided over by the Khan himself, where the great faiths of the empire are pitted against each other. His role is to perform rituals for the protection of the state, to advise the emperor on matters of astrology and divination, and to help oversee the printing of the Buddhist canon using state-of-the-art woodblock technology. He is a man of faith, but he has become a key player in the spiritual politics of a global empire. Finally, let us consider a young man from a Rus princely family, sent as a hostage to the great city of Sarai. He has grown up hearing stories of the terror of the invasion, but now he must live among the conquerors. He learns to speak their Turkic language and to understand their customs. He witnesses the immense wealth that flows into the city from all corners of the world. Slaves from the north, silks from the east, metalwork from the west. He sees the power of the Khan firsthand, watching as princes from his own land and emissaries from distant Egypt offer their tribute and their obedience. He might be conscripted to serve in the Khan's armies, fighting alongside men from a dozen different peoples in a campaign against the Ilkhanate in the Caucasus. He lives in a state of constant tension, a captive in a gilded cage, learning the ways of the enemy in order to survive. The lessons he learns about centralized power, military discipline, and the art of political survival are lessons that he will one day take back with him to Russia. Lessons that will help to build a new kind of state from the ashes of the old. These individual lives, these snapshots of a forgotten world, reveal the true nature of the Mongol Empire. It was not a monolith, but a mosaic. It was a vast, sprawling and often chaotic network of human interactions, a system that brought people from vastly different worlds into sudden and often violent contact. It was an empire of encounters, and it was in these encounters, between merchant and official, between monk and Khan, between captive and conqueror, that the modern world was slowly, painfully and unpredictably being born. The legacy of these encounters is often hidden in plain sight. Take, for example, the concept of diplomacy. The Mongols, in their quest to manage their vast domain, effectively created a pan-Eurasian diplomatic system. The use of passports paisa, the granting of diplomatic immunity to envoys, and the establishment of a formal protocol for communication between rulers became standardized across the continent. When the Ilkhan of Persia sent the Nestorian monk Rabban Soma as his ambassador to the courts of Europe in the 1280s, he was participating in a global diplomatic culture that his own people had largely created. This system forced rulers from different traditions to find a common language of power. A letter from the Great Khan to the Pope or the King of France was a fascinating cultural document. It was typically written in Persian or Turkic, and it followed a strict formula, beginning with an invocation of the power of the eternal sky and ending with a stark choice: submit and prosper, or resist and be destroyed. To European rulers, accustomed to the florid and courtly language of Christian diplomacy, this blunt ultimatum was shocking, but it was also undeniably effective in communicating the scale of Mongol ambition. The movement of people also led to a movement of plants and foods, a Columbian exchange centuries before Columbus. The Mongols and the traders who followed in their wake introduced new crops and new culinary techniques across the continent. Carrots from Persia became more common in China. Chinese noodles and rice cultivation techniques travelled west. The transfer of knowledge was not limited to high science. It extended to the practical arts of farming and cooking, subtly reshaping the daily lives and diets of millions of people. However, the dark side of this exchange was always present. The biological transfer went both ways. While the Black Death was the most dramatic example, it is likely that other, less famous diseases also spread along the Mongol road network. Furthermore, the Mongol conquests themselves were an ecological event. The depopulation of vast areas of agricultural land in Persia and Central Asia led to a process of reforestation, as abandoned farmlands slowly returned to their natural state. Some climate scientists have even argued that this massive reforestation led to a measurable, if temporary, decrease in global atmospheric carbon dioxide, a grim testament to the sheer scale of the human devastation. This complex, multifaceted legacy makes it impossible to render a simple verdict on the Mongol Empire. It was not merely a destructive force, nor was it a benevolent unifier. It was a world historical phenomenon of immense power and complexity, an event that contained within it the seeds of both progress and catastrophe. To study the Mongols is to confront the uncomfortable truth that the forces that connect our world are often the very same forces that can tear it apart. In the end, perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Mongols is the idea of the world itself as a single, interconnected space. Before their conquests, the great civilizations of Eurasia had existed in a state of relative isolation, aware of each other primarily through myth and the slow trickle of trade. The Mongols shattered that isolation forever. They created a world where a man born in Beijing could die in Persia, where a merchant from Venice could serve a Khan in China, and where a disease from the Asian steppe could depopulate the cities of Europe. They gave humanity its first, brutal lesson in globalization. The world we inhabit today, a world of instantaneous communication and global supply chains, is the distant heir of the world the Mongols made. The challenges we face, pandemics that cross borders with ease, the tensions between global integration and local identity, the rise of new powers from the peripheries of the old order, are all themes that echo with surprising clarity in the story of the horsemen who rode out of the steppe in the 13th century. Their empire is long gone, their felt tents have turned to dust, but the questions their story raises about power, connection, and the fate of nations remain as relevant as ever. Their chapter in the book of history is closed, but the world it describes is one we can still, in many ways, recognize as our own. To truly understand the character of the empire after the death of its founder, we must look closely at the man he chose to succeed him, his third son, Ögedei. Ögedei was not a man in his father's mould. Where Genghis was ascetic, disciplined, and driven by a cold, calculating ambition, Ögedei was genial, extravagant, and known for his almost pathological generosity. He was a man who loved grand feasts, deep drinking, and the company of his friends. He was in many ways the first of the imperial Mongols, a ruler who began to grapple with the question of what to do with an empire, rather than simply how to conquer one. It was Ögedei who gave the empire its first fixed capital at Karakorum. His father had ruled from a mobile camp, a city on the move. Ögedei, however, understood the symbolic and practical need for a centre. He ordered the construction of a walled city on the Orkhon River, and while it remained rustic by Chinese or Persian standards, it was a statement of permanence. He built a magnificent palace, the Tumen Amgalan Ordon, or Palace of Myriad Peace, at the heart of which, it was said, stood a great silver tree, an elaborate fountain designed by a captured Parisian goldsmith that dispensed 4 different kinds of alcoholic beverages from its spouts. This tree was a perfect metaphor for Ogedei's rule, a cosmopolitan creation, a testament to the empire's reach, and a dispenser of the conviviality and excess that he so enjoyed. Under Ogedei, the machinery of the empire was formalized and expanded. He established a system of fixed taxation in the conquered lands of China and Persia, moving away from the ad hoc plunder of his father's day. He fully established the yam postal system across the length of the continent. But his most defining trait was his generosity. Stories abound of him ordering the treasury to pay 100 times the asking price for a simple item, or of him chiding a Muslim merchant for not asking for more. He would distribute vast sums of wealth to his relatives and commanders, believing that a ruler's legitimacy was demonstrated by his open-handedness. While this made him personally popular, it also set a precedent for lavish spending that would place an immense strain on the imperial treasury for decades to come. He was building an empire, but he was also building its debts. His personal habits, particularly his love of alcohol, were a source of constant concern for his advisors. His brother Chagatai, a stern enforcer of the Yasa, assigned a special official to count the number of cups of wine Ogedei drank each day, in an attempt to curb his excesses. Ogedei, with his characteristic affability, simply complied by having larger cups made. He ruled the largest empire on earth with a startling lack of personal pretension, a man who saw power not as a burden, but as a resource to be enjoyed and distributed. It was this indulgence that would ultimately lead to his death in 1241, an event that triggered the first great succession crisis and saved a terrified Europe from the armies of Subutai. In the power vacuum that followed Ogedei's death, the fate of the empire fell into the hands of a series of remarkable women. The first was his wife, Töregene, who ruled as regent for 5 years. But the true architect of the empire's second generation was a woman who never ruled in her own name, yet wielded more influence than almost any Khan. This was Sorghaghtani Beki, the widow of Genghis Khan's youngest son Tolui. She was a Nestorian Christian, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and political foresight, and the mother of 4 sons, Mongol, Kublai, Hulagu, and Arik-Burke, all of whom were destined to rule. After her husband's early death, Sorghaghtani took control of the vast and wealthy appanage that had been granted to Tolui's line in northern China and Mongolia. While other Mongol princes were squandering their wealth, she managed her domains with incredible skill and prudence. She promoted agriculture, reduced taxes, and patronized scholars and artisans of all faiths. Her lands became a model of stability and prosperity, a stark contrast to the often chaotic and poorly managed domains of her rivals. She was building a power base, and she was doing it with the tools of peace and good governance. She understood, with a clarity that few of her male counterparts possessed, that the future of the empire lay in a successful partnership between Mongol military might and the administrative expertise of sedentary peoples. She ensured that her sons were not just trained as traditional Mongol warriors, they were given a comprehensive education. They learned the languages and cultures of the peoples they were destined to rule. Kublai became a student of Chinese civilization, while Hulagu was tutored in the arts and sciences of Persia. She was raising her sons not just to be conquerors, but to be emperors. Her political manoeuvring was subtle and masterful. During the regency of Töregene, while others jostled for immediate power, Sorghaghtani played a long game. She remained outwardly loyal, but quietly forged a powerful alliance with Batu Khan of the Golden Horde. When the time was right, after the short and unpopular reign of Guyuk Khan, she and Batu made their move. They orchestrated the Kurultai that bypassed the house of Ogedei and placed her eldest son, Munka, on the throne of the Great Khan. It was a political coup of the highest order, and she was its chief strategist. With Munka as Great Khan, Sorghaghtani's influence reached its zenith. Her 3 other sons were given command of the empire's most critical regions and armies. Kublai was tasked with China, Hulagu with Persia, and Arik-Burke with the Mongolian homeland. She had, in effect, placed one of her sons at each of the 4 cardinal points of the Mongol world. A Christian woman from the Karayat tribe had become the matriarch of the most powerful family on earth. A Persian chronicler, no idle flatterer, wrote of her, "If I were to see among the race of women another woman like her, I would say that the race of women is superior to the race of men." Her death in 1252 was a profound loss for the empire, for she was one of the few figures who possessed the vision and authority to hold its rival factions together. Her son Hulagu's campaign in the Middle East was not merely a military expedition, it was a vast migration of people and ideas. His army was a mobile cross-section of the entire Mongol world. Accompanying the warriors was a huge contingent of Chinese engineers, experts in siege warfare who brought with them the knowledge of gunpowder weapons and massive traction trebuchets. These were the machines that would reduce the walls of Baghdad to rubble. Hulagu also established a great observatory at Marageh, under the direction of the brilliant Persian astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, which became the most advanced centre for astronomical research in the world. Its work would directly influence later European astronomers and represents the apex of the Ilkhanate's scientific patronage. The cultural life of the Ilkhanate was a direct product of this forced fusion. The court at Tabriz became a vibrant centre for the arts, where Mongol patrons commissioned works from Persian artists. The result was a new, hybrid style, most famously seen in the Persian miniature. In these, intricate paintings, the traditional lyrical landscapes and poetic scenes of Persian art were suddenly populated with figures in Mongol dress, with East Asian facial features. The very clouds and dragons depicted in the skies of these paintings were rendered in a style borrowed directly from Chinese scroll painting. It was a visual representation of the new world the Mongols had created, a world where the artistic traditions of Tabriz and Beijing could meet and merge on a single page. At the heart of this intellectual ferment stood the towering figure of Rashid al-Din Hamadani, a Persian Jew who had converted to Islam and risen to become the vizier, or chief minister to Ghazan Khan. Rashid al-Din was a true Renaissance man. He was a physician, a historian, a theologian, and a brilliant administrator. Under Ghazan's orders, he undertook one of the most ambitious intellectual projects of the Middle Ages, the Jami al-Tawarik, the Compendium of Chronicles. This was no ordinary history. It was a conscious attempt to write the first true history of the world. Using the unparalleled resources of the Mongol Empire, Rashid al-Din gathered a team of scholars from across the known world. He consulted with a Buddhist monk from Kashmir for the history of India and the life of the Buddha. He worked with Chinese officials to compile a detailed history of the dynasties of China. He interviewed European monks and merchants for the history of the popes and emperors of Europe. He combined all of this with the rich historical traditions of the Islamic world and the secret oral histories of the Mongols themselves, which had only recently been written down. The result was a book that transcended the parochial boundaries of previous chronicles, a work that reflected the global consciousness that the Mongol Empire had, for the first time, made possible. The conflict between the Ilkhanate and the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt was the great defining struggle of the Western Mongol world. The Battle of Ain Jalut was not the final word, but the opening salvo in a war that would last for over half a century. This was a true clash of titans. On one side was the Ilkhanate, with its vast resources, its Chinese siege engineers, and its multi-ethnic armies. On the other was the Mamluk Sultanate, a military state par excellence, whose elite slave soldiers were the undisputed masters of heavy cavalry tactics, and whose strategic depth in Egypt made them incredibly difficult to defeat. The frontier between them, in Syria and Palestine, became a vast and bloody chessboard. Armies marched and countermarched across the Levant. Cities like Aleppo and Damascus were captured and recaptured multiple times. This was a new kind of warfare, a long grinding war of attrition between two highly organised and well-matched powers. It also involved a complex diplomatic game. The Ilkhan, seeking to open a second front, sent multiple embassies to the popes and the kings of Europe, proposing a Grand Franco-Mongol alliance against their common Muslim enemy. These proposals, though they resulted in much curious correspondence, never came to fruition. The dream of a joint Christian-Mongol crusade to reclaim Jerusalem remained just that, a dream. The Mamluks, for their part, forged a crucial alliance with the Golden Horde to the north. United by their shared Islamic faith and their mutual enmity towards the Ilkhanate, the Horde and the Mamluks coordinated their strategies. When the Ilkhans planned an invasion of Syria, the Golden Horde would often launch a diversionary attack in the Caucasus, forcing the Ilkhans to divide their forces. This strategic pincer movement was a key factor in the Mamluks' ability to hold the line. and ultimately prevent the Mongols from ever gaining a permanent foothold on the eastern Mediterranean. The great Mongol war machine had finally met its match, not in a single battle, but in a sustained multi-generational conflict against an equally determined and sophisticated military power. The inherent flaw in the Mongol imperial system, the problem that plagued all four of the successor Khanates and ultimately guaranteed their fragmentation, was the method of succession. The Kurultai was an institution born on the steppe. It was a council of chieftains, a meeting of the military elite to elect the most capable leader from among the eligible princes of the royal line. It was a system well suited to a nomadic confederation, where the leaders needed the active consent of the warrior aristocracy they commanded. But when this system was applied to a vast, bureaucratic, sedentary empire, it was a recipe for disaster. There was no principle of primogeniture, no automatic succession from father to eldest son. Every time a Khan died, the entire empire was thrown into a state of suspended animation. All the senior princes and generals from across the continent were required to abandon their posts and travel to the distant homeland for the election, a process that could take years. During this interregnum, the empire was rudderless, and all military campaigns came to a halt. This is precisely what saved Europe in 1241, and what forced Hulagu to withdraw from Syria in 1260. Worse still, each Kurultai was an invitation to civil war. The different branches of the family would put forward their own candidates, and the election would become a struggle between powerful factions. The Toluid Revolution, which brought Munka to power, was essentially a political coup ratified by a rigged Kurultai. The subsequent war between Kublai and his brother Arik Böke was a war between two rival Kurultais, one held in China and one in Mongolia, both claiming ultimate legitimacy. The system designed to produce the strongest leader now served only to tear the ruling family apart, transforming brothers into rivals and cousins into mortal enemies. It was a political structure that could not outlive the unity of the family that created it. While the princes fought amongst themselves, the peoples they ruled were not always passive subjects. Resistance to Mongol rule took many forms. In the mountainous terrain of southern China, Song loyalists fought a desperate guerrilla war for years after the fall of their capital. In Persia, secretive Ismaili groups, the remnants of the assassins, continued to operate from hidden mountain refuges. But the most successful examples of resistance came from those lands whose geography was fundamentally unsuited to the Mongol way of war. The invasions of Vietnam, then known as Jai Viet, were a case in point. The Mongols sent massive armies there on 3 separate occasions, and each time they were defeated. The Vietnamese, under the brilliant leadership of the Tran dynasty, refused to meet the Mongols in open battle. Instead, they practiced a strategy of scorched earth, retreating into the dense malarial jungles and allowing the climate and disease to wear down the invaders. They used their knowledge of the terrain to launch hit-and-run attacks, and in a brilliant tactical stroke, they planted iron-tipped stakes in the bed of the Bac Dang River, luring the Mongol supply fleet into the trap at high tide and then destroying it as the tide went out. The jungles of Southeast Asia, like the deserts of Sinai, proved to be a barrier that the steppe horsemen could not overcome. The failed invasions of Japan were an even more dramatic example of the limits of Mongol power. For the Mongols, this was an entirely new kind of warfare. It required them to become a naval power, to build vast fleets and transport their armies across the sea. This they did, conscripting thousands of Korean and Chinese shipbuilders and sailors. But they were not natural seamen. Their fleets were hastily built and poorly designed for the open ocean. And they were confronting a society in Japan that was, in its own way, as fiercely martial as their own. The Japanese samurai, fighting on their home soil, put up a ferocious defence. They built stone walls along the likely invasion beaches and fought with a desperate courage, born of the conviction that they were defending a sacred land. But in the end, their most powerful ally was the weather. The 2 great typhoons, the kamikaze, that destroyed the Mongol fleets were seen as a sign of divine intervention, proof that Japan was a special land protected by its gods. For the Mongols, it was a devastating lesson in the power of nature and the immense difficulty of projecting their land-based power across the sea. The horizon of the steppe had a limit, and that limit was the ocean's shore. The economic engine of the Mongol Empire was the city, despite their own nomadic disdain for urban life. Once conquered, the great cities of the Silk Road and beyond were transformed into crucial nodes in the imperial network. A city like Tabriz in Persia, or Sarai on the Volga, was not just a collection of houses and markets, it was a complex machine for generating and controlling wealth. The Mongols were the masters of this machine, even if they preferred to camp in their gyrs on the plains outside the city walls. Within these cities, a class of intermediary merchants, known as Ortok, rose to prominence. These were often Muslim traders from Central Asia, who entered into partnership with Mongol nobles. The Mongol noble would provide the capital, often vast sums of silver plundered from recent conquests, and the Ortok merchant would use that capital to finance long-distance caravan trade. It was a symbiotic relationship. The noble, who was culturally barred from engaging in commerce himself, could invest his wealth and see it grow. The merchant gained access to state-level capital and, more importantly, the political protection of a powerful patron, symbolised by the paisa that gave him priority at the yam stations. This system effectively turned the entire empire into a vast state-sponsored enterprise zone, fueling the commercial boom of the Pax Mongolica. The currency that lubricated this system was a fascinating mix of the old and the new. In the Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde, traditional silver and gold coins continued to be minted, though now they bore the name of the ruling Khan. But in Yuan China, Kublai Khan took a radical step. He made paper money the sole legal tender for all major transactions. This was not a new invention. Paper money had existed in China for centuries, but Kublai enforced its use with a rigour and on a scale that was unprecedented. This paper money was, in essence, a fiat currency, its value based entirely on the decree of the state, not on any intrinsic value of the material it was printed on. To maintain its stability, the government established a strict system. Old, worn-out notes could be exchanged for new ones at provincial treasuries, and the currency was theoretically backed by reserves of silver held by the state. For a time, the system worked brilliantly, astonishing foreign visitors like Marco Polo, who marvelled at how the great Khan could make pieces of mulberry bark function as if they were pure gold. It was a sophisticated tool of fiscal policy that allowed the state to manage the economy and finance its vast expenditures. However, in the later, less disciplined years of the dynasty, the temptation to simply print more money to cover deficits proved irresistible, leading to the hyperinflation that helped to cripple the Yuan economy and fuel popular unrest. The fall of the Yuan dynasty and the retreat of the Mongols to the steppe did not end their story, but it did transform it. In the centuries that followed, the history of the Mongols became a history of division and a long, slow struggle against the encroaching power of the sedentary world. The descendants of the Yuan emperors, ruling as the Northern Yuan, saw themselves as the legitimate rulers of all Mongolia, but they were constantly challenged by the rise of the Oirats, a powerful confederation of Western Mongol tribes who were not descendants of Genghis Khan. This internal rivalry between the Eastern, Chinggisid, and Western, Oirat Mongols defined the politics of the steppe for over 200 years. It was a period of shifting alliances and brutal internecine warfare, punctuated by periodic raids into Ming China. The Ming responded with a defensive strategy centered on the Great Wall, which they rebuilt and extended into the massive stone and brick structure we know today. The wall was a symbol of a new reality. The initiative had passed from the steppe to the Saône. The primary goal of the great sedentary empire was no longer to manage a remote barbarian threat, but to wall off and contain a once dominant power that now lived on its borders. One of the most powerful figures to emerge from this period of turmoil was a man named Esen Taishi, the leader of the Oirats in the mid-15th century. He was a brilliant military commander who managed to briefly reunite the Mongol tribes under his own non-Chinggisid banner. In 1449, in an event known as the Tumu Crisis, he launched a major invasion of China. In a stunning display of the old Mongol military prowess, he lured a massive Ming army, led personally by the young Zhengtong emperor, into a trap and annihilated it. In an almost unbelievable turn of events, the Chinese emperor himself was captured and taken hostage. Esen held the Son of Heaven captive in his nomadic camp, a a humiliation for the Ming dynasty that was almost without parallel. However, he was unable to translate this incredible military victory into a lasting political gain. The Ming court simply placed a new emperor on the throne, refusing to ransom the old one. Essen's Mongol confederation, held together only by his personal charisma, soon fell apart. He was assassinated by his own rebellious followers, and the dream of a renewed, unified Mongol empire under Oirat leadership died with him. The Tumu crisis was a spectacular flare-up of nomadic power, but it was also a demonstration of its ultimate futility against the vast, resilient bureaucratic state of Ming China. A more lasting transformation came not from the sword, but from the prayer book. In the 16th century, the Eastern Mongol Khans, seeking a new source of legitimacy to bolster their claims to leadership, forged a powerful alliance with the rising Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. The Mongol ruler Altan Khan bestowed the title of Dalai Lama, Ocean of Wisdom, upon the leader of the Gelug school, and in return the Dalai Lama recognized Altan Khan as a reincarnation of Kublai Khan, thus re-establishing a spiritual link to the glorious imperial past. This second conversion to Tibetan Buddhism spread rapidly throughout Mongolia, and it had a profound and lasting impact on the Mongol people. It was a largely peaceful revolution that reshaped their culture from the ground up. The old shamanistic beliefs were suppressed, and thousands of Buddhist monasteries were built across the steppes. A huge portion of the male population became monks, redirecting the energies of a martial society towards spiritual pursuits. While this conversion brought literacy and a sophisticated ethical philosophy to Mongolia, it also arguably contributed to the decline of its military power. The warrior of the steppe was slowly being replaced by the monk in the monastery. It was this internally divided and increasingly pacific Mongolia that faced the last great imperial power to emerge from the northern frontiers of China, the Manchus. The Manchus were a Tungusic people from the forests of what is now northeastern China. Like the Mongols before them, they were a tribal people who were unified by a charismatic leader, Nurhaci, in the early 17th century. They created a powerful military state, and, in 1644, they swept south of the Great Wall, overthrew the collapsing Ming dynasty, and established their own dynasty, the Qing. The Qing emperors were masters of a dual identity. In China, they ruled as Confucian sons of heaven, but in their dealings with the peoples of the steppe, they presented themselves as great Khans, the rightful successors to the Mongol Empire. They skillfully exploited the divisions between the various Mongol groups, using a combination of military force, matrimonial alliances, and religious patronage to bring them into their sphere of influence. By the late 18th century, under the long and brilliant reign of the Qianlong Emperor, all of the Mongol lands, Inner Mongolia, Outer Mongolia, and the territories of the Oirats had been incorporated into the vast multi-ethnic Qing Empire. The long and turbulent story of the independent steppe nomad, which had begun in prehistory, had finally come to an end. The people who had once conquered the world were now themselves a conquered people. The shadow of the Mongol Empire also loomed large over the formation of the early modern Iran. After the collapse of the Ilkhanate, Iran was a fractured land, ruled by a patchwork of local dynasties. This political fragmentation was finally ended in the early 16th century by the rise of a new power, the Safavids. The Safavids were a dynasty of Turkic-speaking Sufi mystics who converted to Shia Islam and launched a holy war to conquer Iran. They succeeded, and in doing so they created the foundations of the modern Iranian state, establishing Twelver Shi'ism as the official state religion, a decision that defines the religious identity of Iran to this day. The Safavid state was, in many ways, a direct inheritor of the political and cultural traditions of the Ilkhanate. Its administrative structures, its systems of taxation, and its courtly culture all bore the deep imprint of the Turco-Mongol world that had preceded it. The Safavid Shahs, though Persian in their high culture, were ethnically Turkic and ruled over a military elite that was predominantly Turkic-speaking, a direct legacy of the nomadic warriors who had entered the region with the Mongols. The art of the Safavid period, with its magnificent carpets and its exquisite miniature paintings, was a direct continuation and refinement of the artistic traditions that had blossomed under the patronage of their Ilkhanid predecessors. Further west, the final fall of the Byzantine Empire and the rise of the Ottoman Empire can also be seen as a downstream consequence of the Mongol invasions. The Mongol destabilization of Anatolia in the mid-13th century, which shattered the power of the Seljuk Sultanate, created a power vacuum on the frontiers of the Byzantine world. Into this chaotic environment flowed waves of Turkic nomads, fleeing the Mongol advance. It was from one of these small Turkic warrior bands, led by a chieftain named Osman, that the future Ottoman Empire would emerge. The Mongols had inadvertently acted as the bellows that fanned a small frontier flame into a world-consuming fire. Thus, as we survey the world of the 16th and 17th centuries, we see a landscape populated by great gunpowder empires: the Ottomans in the Mediterranean, the Safavids in Iran, the Mughals in India, the Qing in China, and the Russian Empire expanding across Siberia. All of these powerful, centralized, absolutist states were, in a very real sense, the heirs of the Mongol Empire. All of them, with the exception of the Ottomans, were founded by dynasties that claimed a direct or indirect lineage back to Genghis Khan or Timur. They had learned the Mongol lessons of centralized military power, bureaucratic control, and multi-ethnic state building, and they had combined them with the new technology of firearms to create a new and durable form of imperial rule. The Mongol moment may have passed, but the Mongol model of the state echoed for centuries. This grand geopolitical narrative, however, can sometimes obscure the deeply personal and often tragic human stories that lie at the heart of this history. Consider the fate of the Alans, a Christian people from the Caucasus Mountains. During the Mongol invasions, many were conscripted into the Mongol armies and forcibly relocated. An entire Alan Imperial Guard unit was established in the service of Kublai Khan in faraway Dadu. These men were exiles, warriors serving a foreign master thousands of miles from their homeland, a living testament to the empire's practice of scattering and reorganizing conquered peoples to break their local loyalties. Or consider the countless artisans and scholars who were uprooted from their homes and taken to the great imperial centres. A weaver from Damascus might find himself working in a textile workshop in Central Asia, his skills now serving the Mongol court. A physician from Baghdad might be sent to the Ilkhan's court in Persia, his medical knowledge added to the cosmopolitan pool of imperial science. For these individuals, the empire meant a loss of freedom, a life of forced servitude, but their forced migration was also the very mechanism by which skills, ideas and technologies were spread across the continent. The great cultural fusion of the Pax Mongolica was built upon a foundation of countless personal tragedies. The story of the so-called Lost Golden Tribe of the Mongols is another poignant echo of this era. This refers to the descendants of the Mongol soldiers and administrators who settled in Persia with Hulagu and his successors. After the Ilkhanate collapsed and the new Safavid dynasty enforced Shia Islam, many of these Sunni Mongol and Turkic peoples were either forcibly converted or fled. Some found refuge in the lands of what is now Afghanistan, where their descendants, the Hazara people, live to this day. The distinctive East Asian features of the Hazara and their historical traditions point to a direct lineage from the armies of Genghis Khan and Hulagu, making them a living, and often persecuted minority, who are a direct genetic and cultural legacy of the Mongol presence in the region. These stories remind us that the Mongol Empire was not an abstract historical force. It was a lived reality, a chaotic and often terrifying world that reshaped the lives of millions of individuals in profound and irreversible ways. It was a story of displacement and adaptation, of survival and memory, of how people and cultures cope when their world is shattered, and a new, unfamiliar one is imposed upon them by force. The modern rediscovery of the Mongol Empire's true significance is a relatively recent phenomenon. For centuries, the narrative in the West was dominated by the chronicles of the conquered, which portrayed the Mongols as little more than an undifferentiated savage horde, a divine scourge sent to punish the sins of Christendom. It was only in the 20th century, with the rise of a more global approach to history and the painstaking work of scholars who could read sources in Chinese, Persian, Arabic and Russian, that a more nuanced and complex picture began to emerge. This new scholarship revealed the Mongol Empire not as a historical accident, but as a complex and sophisticated system with its own internal logic. It highlighted their innovations in military organization, their creation of a continental system of communication and trade, their surprising pragmatism and religious tolerance, and their crucial role as transmitters of culture and technology. It transformed our understanding of the 13th century, recasting it not as a dark age of barbaric destruction, but as a pivotal, if violent, age of global connection, a first axial age of Eurasian integration. Today, the most powerful symbol of this re-evaluation stands on the plains of Mongolia, not far from Ulaanbaatar. It is a colossal, 131-foot-tall stainless steel statue of Genghis Khan on horseback, the largest equestrian statue in the world. Visitors can take an elevator up through the horse's body to stand on a viewing platform on the horse's head, looking out over the vast empty steppe that was the conqueror's birthplace and his final resting place. The statue is a statement of modern Mongolian national identity, a defiant reclaiming of their most famous and controversial ancestor. It looks eastward towards his birthplace, and it holds a golden whip in its hand, a symbol of authority and leadership. To an outsider, it might seem a glorification of a brutal past, but to many Mongolians, it is a symbol of a lost greatness, a reminder of a time when their small landlocked nation was the centre of the world. It is a monument to the enduring power of history to shape the present, and to the complex, contested and ever-shifting nature of historical memory itself. The very soil of the conquered lands holds a deep memory of the Mongol presence, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. A fascinating example lies in the genetic landscape of modern Asia. In the early 2000s, geneticists conducting a massive survey of Y chromosome data from populations across Asia stumbled upon a startling discovery. They found a particular genetic marker, a specific lineage that was present in an unusually high percentage of the male population in a vast swathe of territory, from the Pacific coast all the way to the Caspian Sea. This genetic signature was carried by approximately 8% of the men within this region, which translates to a staggering 0.5% of the total world male population, or about 16 million men. By tracing the mutations and calculating the timeline, the researchers dated the origin of this lineage to a single common ancestor who lived in Mongolia approximately 1,000 years ago. The geographic distribution of this lineage corresponds almost perfectly with the borders of the former Mongol Empire. The conclusion, while not definitive, is highly suggestive. This is the genetic footprint of Genghis Khan and his male relatives. The Mongol Khans and their princes were famously polygamous, maintaining vast harems populated by wives, concubines, and the captured women of conquered royal families. Genghis Khan himself had numerous sons by his principal wives, and likely dozens, if not hundreds, more by other women. His male descendants, who formed the ruling aristocracy of the empire for centuries, continued this practice. The spread of this specific Y chromosome lineage was not the result of a single event, but a sustained, centuries-long process of social selection, where the reproductive success of a small group of elite men was amplified to an unprecedented degree by the power of the empire they had built. It is a stark and intimate testament to the way power can be written, quite literally, into the human genome. Another subtle but profound legacy of the Mongol era can be found in the way states conceive of and control their territory. Before the Mongols, borders in many parts of the world were fluid and ill-defined. A kingdom's power radiated out from a central court and faded away in the marches and frontier zones. The Mongols, with their obsession for order and their systematic approach to administration, brought a new level of precision to the mapping and organisation of space. Their census was not just about counting people, it was about defining taxable units of land and production. The Yam system was not just a series of post houses, it was a network that stitched together the empire, imposing a grid of imperial control onto the physical landscape. When the successor states like Ming China and Muscovite Russia emerged, they inherited this conception of the state as a clearly defined, inventoried and centrally administered territory. The idea of a fixed, patrolled border, symbolised by the Great Wall or the lines of Russian forts pushing into Siberia, was a direct response to the Mongol model of a mobile, expansionist power. The modern territorial state, with its claims to absolute sovereignty, within clearly demarcated frontiers, has some of its deepest roots in the administrative revolution of the Mongol Empire, let's explore the end of one of the great Khanates in more detail, the final years of the Ilkhanate in Persia. The death of the last strong Ilkhan, Abu Sa'id, in 1335, without an heir, created an immediate and catastrophic power vacuum. The great Mongol emirs, the commanders who had once been the pillars of the state, now became its destroyers. Each one backed a different, often ludicrously unsuitable puppet claimant to the throne, a distant cousin, a child, and plunged the realm into a brutal civil war known as the period of the emirs. For several decades, Persia was a chessboard for these competing warlords. The country was torn apart. The sophisticated irrigation systems that had supported Persian agriculture for millennia fell into disrepair. The trade routes that had brought such wealth into the country became unsafe, and commerce withered. The delicate balance that the later Ilkhans had struck between the Mongol military elite and the Persian bureaucratic class completely broke down. It was a slow, agonizing process of state failure, a descent into chaos that left the land vulnerable and exhausted. This period of anarchy produced one of the most poignant works of Persian literature, a satirical poem by Ubayd Zakani called Mush Gurba, The Mouse and the Cat. On the surface, it is a simple fable about a war between the mice of Kerman and the cats of Isfahan. But for its contemporary readers, it was a searing and bitter allegory for the times. The tyrannical, wine-swilling cat king and his rapacious followers were a clear stand-in for the destructive Mongol warlords, while the suffering and foolish mice represented the hapless Persian population. The poem is a testament to how people use art and satire to make sense of a world that is falling apart, to find a voice in a time of political powerlessness. It was into this fractured and demoralized Persia that Timur, or Tamerlane, would later march. He did not have to conquer a strong unified state, he simply had to pick up the pieces of a shattered one. His brutal campaigns can be seen as the final, violent spasm of the Mongol era in Persia, an attempt to restore a lost imperial unity through sheer, overwhelming force. But his empire of terror could not last, and it was only with the rise of the Safavids over a century later that a stable, native Persian dynasty would once again rule over a unified Iranian plateau. The memory of the Ilkhanate became a cautionary tale of how quickly an empire, even one at the height of its cultural and scientific glory, can unravel from within. The story of the Mongol impact on the environment is also a subject of growing historical interest. Their campaigns were not just human tragedies, they were ecological events. The destruction of the intricate Khanate irrigation systems in Persia and Central Asia was a particularly devastating blow. These were ancient underground canals, sometimes stretching for miles, that had been painstakingly built and maintained over centuries to carry water from the mountains to the arid plains. They were the lifeblood of the region's agriculture and the foundation of its great cities. The Mongol armies, in their sieges, often deliberately destroyed these khanates to cut off water supplies to cities. In the chaotic aftermath of the invasions, the central authority needed to maintain and repair this complex system vanished. Many khanates silted up and were abandoned. The result was a long-term process of desertification in some regions. Lands that had once been fertile gardens reverted to steppe or desert. This was not a deliberate policy of environmental destruction, but a catastrophic side effect of a military strategy that prioritized the swift subjugation of cities over the long-term health of the agrarian landscape. The ecological scars of the 13th century are, in some parts of the Middle East, still visible today. Conversely, in China, the Yuan dynasty undertook some massive and ambitious works of public engineering. The most significant of these was the extension and rebuilding of the Grand Canal. This ancient waterway, which linked the fertile Yangtze River Valley in the south with the political centres in the north, was the primary artery for transporting grain to the capital. Kublai Khan's engineers straightened and deepened the canal, creating a direct, efficient route to his new capital at Dadu. This colossal undertaking, which required the labour of millions of conscripted Chinese peasants, was a logistical masterpiece that ensured the capital could be fed and the army supplied. It was another example of the Mongol genius for infrastructure and control, applied on a scale that few native dynasties had ever attempted. The Mongol legacy in the realm of cuisine is another fascinating and often overlooked area. While the elite were adopting the sophisticated dishes of their subjects, a more humble process of culinary exchange was also taking place. The simple, hearty fare of the era of steppe nomads left its mark. The emphasis on roasted and grilled meats, the use of dairy products like yogurt in savoury dishes, and the popularity of various types of dumplings and filled pastas are all features that can be traced, in part, to the influence of the Turco-Mongol migrations. Dishes like the kebab, the manti, and the samsa, which are found in various forms from the Balkans to Central Asia, are all part of a shared culinary heritage that was solidified and spread during the era of the Mongol Empire. Even the way we drink tea was influenced by these connections. The practice of drinking tea was widespread in China, but it was the Mongol-ruled Yuan dynasty that truly established a connection between the tea-producing regions of southern China and the markets of Persia and the Middle East. The overland trade in bricks of compressed tea, which were easy to transport on camels, flourished along the Silk Road. The Persian word for tea, che, is derived directly from its Mandarin Chinese equivalent, che, a linguistic testament to this Mongol-era trade route. Let us consider the final retreat of the Yuan from China in 1368. It is often portrayed as a dramatic, humiliating expulsion. But in another sense, it was a strategic withdrawal. The last Yuan emperor, Toghon Temür, did not make a final stand at his capital. He recognised that the mandate of heaven was lost, and that the military situation was hopeless. Instead of sacrificing his army and his people in a futile defence, he chose to preserve the core of the Mongol state. He packed up his court, his administration, and his loyal troops, and simply returned to the steppe. This act was, in a way, a return to the fundamental Mongol strategic principle: mobility is life. When faced with an untenable position, you do not stubbornly hold your ground and die. You retreat, you regroup, and you live to fight another day. By abandoning China, the Mongols were not ceasing to exist. They were simply returning to their natural element, the open grassland, where they could revert to their traditional way of life and war. The northern Yuan dynasty they established would remain a significant power, a thorn in the side of the Ming for another 2 centuries. It was a failure to hold the empire, but it was a success in terms of national survival. This enduring connection to the steppe, to the nomadic ideal, is perhaps the most romantic and tragic element of the Mongol story. They were a people who conquered the world but never truly found a home in it. The courts of Dadu and Tabriz were magnificent, but they were also gilded cages. The true Mongol palace was the sky, and its carpet was the endless grass. The empire was a spectacular, century-long deviation from this ideal, a grand and bloody experiment in ruling the sedentary world on nomadic terms. When the experiment failed, as it was perhaps always destined to, the survivors simply went home. The final subjugation of the Mongols by the Qing dynasty in the 18th century was a quiet, almost administrative end to this long story. There was no single dramatic battle. It was a slow process of political absorption, of economic pressure, and of cultural transformation through the patronage of Buddhism. The Qing established a system of banners, a military administrative structure that organised the Mongols into fixed units and tied them to specific territories, effectively ending their nomadic mobility. They were disarmed, their khans reduced to salaried officials of the Qing state. The people who had once terrified the world with their mobility were now pinned to the map, their traditional way of life circumscribed and controlled by a vast bureaucratic empire that had learned all of their own lessons about control and organisation and had turned them back upon them. It is a poignant irony of history that the last great nomadic empire, the Qing, built by the Manchus, would be the one to finally solve the problem of the steppe nomads that had plagued Chinese dynasties for 2 millennia. They did it not just by building walls, but by mastering the political and cultural landscape of Inner Asia, by becoming khans of khans themselves, and by slowly, methodically, and relentlessly dismantling the foundations of the nomadic way of life. The age of the great steppe confederations, which had reached its terrifying apex under Genghis Khan, had finally and quietly been brought to a close. The silence that descended upon the steppe in the 18th and 19th centuries was the silence of a world that had been pacified and incorporated into a larger imperial system. But beneath that silence, the memories and the traditions of the great empire were preserved. They were preserved in the oral epics recited by bards around the campfire, in the secret histories of the Mongol royal family, and in the names of the mountains and rivers that were still believed to be home to the spirits of their ancestors. The empire was gone, but the nation, the people forged in the crucible of Genghis Khan's conquests, endured, waiting for the great empires that had swallowed them to, in their own turn, crumble and fall. This opportunity would come in the early 20th century. With the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1911, the Mongols of Outer Mongolia seized the chance to declare their independence. It was a fragile, contested independence, soon caught in the great geopolitical game between the newly formed Republic of China and the rising power of Soviet Russia. For much of the 20th century, Mongolia would be a socialist republic, a satellite state of the Soviet Union. During this period, the legacy of Genghis Khan was actively suppressed. He was condemned as a feudal reactionary, a figure incompatible with the new communist ideology. Monasteries were destroyed, and any expression of nationalist sentiment was brutally punished. It was only with the fall of the Soviet Union and the peaceful democratic revolution in Mongolia in 1990 that the nation was once again free to reclaim its own history. And the figure they reclaimed with the most passion and pride was the one who had been forbidden for so long, Genghis Khan. The revival of his memory was a central part of the post-socialist nation-building project. He was the symbol of their sovereignty, of their unique identity, and of their historical greatness. The conqueror, who had been a figure of terror for the world, became, for his own people, the ultimate symbol of freedom and national pride. This modern relationship with their imperial past is a complex one. It is a source of immense pride, but also a recognition of a legacy that is difficult for the outside world to understand. The story of the Mongol Empire is a story of their ancestors, but it is also a story that belongs to the world, a story that is remembered in very different ways in Beijing, in Moscow, in Tehran, and in Ulaanbaatar. To grapple with the legacy of Genghis Khan is to grapple with the very nature of history itself, its capacity to inspire and to horrify, its power to unite and to divide, and its enduring presence in the world we all share. The sheer speed of the Mongol conquest often gives the impression of a single, unstoppable wave. In reality, it was a multi-generational project, a relay race of conquest passed from father to son. The character of the empire changed with each generation, reflecting the personalities and priorities of its rulers. The transition from the era of Genghis to the era of Ogedei was a shift from relentless, disciplined conquest to a more static and even hedonistic imperial administration. The transition to the generation of Menka and his brothers was another dramatic shift, a restoration of stern, conservative purpose, but also the moment when the fatal cracks in the family's unity became undeniable chasms. One of the most revealing aspects of this generational change was the evolving relationship between the different branches of the ruling family. Genghis Khan had 4 sons by his principal wife, Berta, Yochi, Chagatai, Ogedei, and Tolui. Their relationship was the bedrock upon which the empire was built. Genghis himself had carefully balanced their roles. Chagatai, the second son, was a harsh and conservative figure, and he was appointed as the guardian of the Yasa, the law code. His role was to be the empire's enforcer, the one who would ensure that the old traditions were upheld. Ogedei, the third son, was the affable and generous successor. Tolui, the youngest, inherited the Mongol heartland, the hearth, as was the nomadic tradition. But the most complex and tragic figure among the first generation was the eldest son, Yochi. A cloud of uncertainty hung over his birth. He was born shortly after his mother, Berta, was rescued from her abduction by the Merkit tribe. This led to persistent rumours that he was not Genghis Khan's biological son. Though Genghis always treated him as his own, the stigma remained. During a crucial council to determine the succession, Chagatai openly and insultingly questioned Yochi's parentage, leading to a bitter and violent confrontation between the brothers. This incident was a grim foreshadowing of the future. The rift between the lines of Yochi and Chagatai would become one of the most enduring and destructive fault lines in the empire. Yochi died before his father, and his vast appanage, the westernmost part of the empire, which would become the Golden Horde, was inherited by his son Batu. The descendants of Jochi, ruling from the far west, always maintained a sense of separateness, a feeling that they had been cheated of their rightful place at the centre of the empire. This deep-seated resentment fueled their rivalry with the other branches of the family, particularly with the line of Tolui that would eventually seize the throne. The family drama of the first generation became the geopolitical conflict of the next. We can also see the evolution of the empire in the way the Mongols perceived themselves. The early Mongols under Genghis saw themselves as a chosen people, instruments of the eternal sky, on a divine mission. Their identity was fierce, exclusive, and defined by their nomadic way of life. By the time of Kublai Khan, this identity had become far more complex and cosmopolitan. Kublai ruled not just as a Mongol great Khan, but also as a Chinese emperor, the founder of the Yuan dynasty. He was a patron of Tibetan Buddhism and an employer of Muslim administrators. He was a figure who had to balance multiple identities, to speak multiple cultural languages in order to rule his diverse empire. This created a fundamental tension that ran through his entire reign. To his Chinese subjects, he needed to appear as a legitimate son of heaven, a wise and benevolent Confucian ruler. He adopted a Chinese dynastic name, built his capital according to Chinese principles, and performed the necessary rituals. But to the Mongol aristocracy back in the homeland, these actions were seen as a betrayal, a dangerous slide into the soft, corrupting ways of the sedentary Chinese. His traditionalist brother, Arik Böke, based his claim to the throne precisely on this platform, that he was the true heir to the authentic nomadic legacy of Genghis Khan, while Kublai was becoming a decadent Chinese emperor. This culture war between the traditionalists and the accommodationists was fought in every corner of the empire. It was present in the Chagatai Khanate's long struggle between the factions who favoured urban life and those who clung to the Yasa. It was a factor in the Golden Horde's decision to embrace Islam, a move that gave them a distinct identity, but also separated them from the more shamanistic and Buddhist branches of the family. The Mongol Empire was not just a political entity. It was a vast, ongoing debate about what it meant to be Mongol, in a world that the Mongols themselves had transformed. This internal struggle is one of the key reasons why the Mongol legacy is so different in different regions. In Russia, where the Golden Horde ruled at a distance, the Mongols remained a distinctly alien force, the Tatar yoke. There was a clear separation between the rulers and the ruled. In Persia, under the Ilkhanate, the Mongol elite eventually assimilated, converting to Islam and merging into the local Persian and Turkic culture, leaving behind a rich artistic and architectural legacy, but disappearing as a distinct ethnic group. In China, under the Yuan, they attempted to maintain a strict separation, but were ultimately overthrown and expelled. There was no single Mongol imperial experience. There were many, each shaped by the unique cultural and political dynamics of the region. The sheer variety of human experience within the empire's borders is almost impossible to fathom. A farmer in the south of China, whose village was required to provide grain for the imperial army, and whose sons might be conscripted to build the Grand Canal, would have experienced Mongol rule as a harsh, extractive, and oppressive system. His world was one of hardship and resentment towards a foreign ruling class. A craftsman in a Central Asian city like Bukhara, which had been devastated by the initial invasion, would have had a more complex experience. In the decades that followed, under the stability of the Pax Mongolica, his city might have experienced a commercial boom. He might be producing goods for a market that now stretched from Europe to the Far East. He might see travellers of every conceivable race and creed passing through his city. His experience of Mongol rule would be one of both traumatic memory and newfound economic opportunity. A minor Mongol warrior from a remote tribe, conscripted into the army of Hulagu, would have had a completely different perspective. For him, the empire meant an almost unimaginable journey. He would have left his homeland of felt tents and grassy plains to march across deserts and mountains. He would have seen cities whose size and splendour defied belief. He would have participated in the siege of Baghdad, an event of world historical significance. He might have been granted lands and a pension in the new Ilkhanate, settling in a country whose language and customs were completely alien to him. For him, the empire was a great and perhaps terrifying adventure, a path to wealth and status that would have been unthinkable just a generation earlier. It is in the weaving together of these countless individual stories that the true tapestry of the Mongol Empire can be seen. It was not a static, monolithic block, but a dynamic and ever-changing system, a world in motion. It was a brutal and often terrifying world, but it was also a world of unprecedented connection and exchange. It was a world that was, for a brief, incandescent century, held together by the will of a single family and the power of the horse and the bow. And when it finally fell apart, it left behind the scattered pieces from which our own modern world would begin to be assembled. The story of the Mongols for centuries was told primarily by their enemies. It was a story written in the terrified ink of Persian court historians, in the bewildered chronicles of Russian monks, and in the anxious reports of papal envoys. It was a story told from the outside looking in, a view from the city wall as the dust cloud of the approaching horde gathered on the horizon. But there is another voice, an intimate and secret one that has survived, the voice of the Mongols themselves. This is the secret history of the Mongols, one of the great works of world literature. It is not a formal chronicle or a state-sponsored history. It is a sprawling, raw and unvarnished epic, part foundational myth, part family saga, written in the Mongol language shortly after Genghis Khan's death. Its name comes from its intended audience. It was a private history for the eyes of the royal family only, a record of their origins, their struggles and their triumphs, meant to instruct future generations of the Golden Kin. To read the secret history is to be transported to a different world, to sit by the fire in a felt tent and hear the story as they themselves would have told it. It is a world of shamanic visions, of blood oaths and bitter betrayals, of profound loyalty and brutal pragmatism. It does not hide the humiliations of Temujin's youth, his fear of dogs, his capture and escape, his reliance on his powerful wife. It details the petty jealousies and the violent arguments between the Khan's own sons. It is a story not of gods or monsters, but of flawed, ambitious and utterly compelling human beings. It is the campfire story of a nation, and its earthy, poetic language is the closest we will ever come to hearing the true voice of the 13th century steppe. This internal heroic narrative must be set against the searing testimony of those who stood in the path of the storm. The Arab historian Ibn al-Athir, who lived through the invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, was left in a state of existential despair. He wrote, "For some years I continued to shun the writing of these events, finding them too horrible. If anyone were to say that since God created Adam, the world has not seen a like calamity, he would be telling the truth. For him, and for millions like him, there was no heroic saga, no divine mandate. There was only a catastrophe so immense that it seemed to herald the end of the world itself, a wind that had come to sweep away all the works of man. This profound schism in perception between the heroic self-image of the conqueror and the apocalyptic experience of the conquered is perhaps the most fundamental truth of the Mongol Empire. The force that saw itself as a unifier, an instrument of heaven's will to bring order to a chaotic world, was experienced by its victims as a force of pure nihilistic destruction. This collision of worldviews shattered the confidence of the great sedentary civilizations. It forced scholars and theologians in both the Islamic and Christian worlds to ask agonizing questions. How could God allow such a thing to happen? Was this a divine punishment for their own sins? Or had the old certainties, the old maps of the world and heaven, been rendered meaningless by the arrival of this new, inexplicable power from beyond the known horizon?